I will say this clearly. In Britain, we have had the best model. I've been around the world, right, and you take it for granted in some ways.
Alcohol is prohibited, full stop, the end.
What about the slaves, right, and the right hand that you possess? Does it mean now we're going to go around Birmingham saying, all right, we're going to have slaves?
There's a difference between making slaves and managing pre-existing slaves. So the Quran doesn't say make new slaves.
Answer, right? Like everybody has a different experience and everybody has a different understanding of what of what Islam means to them.
No, because we're talking about Islam. We're not talking about Muslim experience, and they're different things. Is Islam compatible to Western values, which was an earlier question? Why does it have to be?
I've been to many ISOC events where we've spoken about racism within Islam, because those are the ugly truth that we often hide away from.
Race identity or even gender identity politics, which Muslims have adopted from the West, thinking, oh, this is the current discourse happening within the West, let's borrow it to get our own liberation. Why can't you just go from your own basis and perspective to get your own liberation? Islam is meant to end al-Sabiyya, not reinforce it.
They are pushing forward an assimilationist agenda, so they confuse integration with assimilation. You know, they want to get rid of sort of public articulations, the public presence of difference altogether.
For me, it's directly linked to the war on terror. When you justify killing and dehumanising hundreds and thousands, indeed millions of people abroad, part of that is you dehumanise that same minority in this country. And
so then what is British? Well, what really can't be defined, and the reason why it can't be defined and no one ever dares define it is because it's not really about a label or the definition, it's about loyalty, and it always has been. And you're fooling yourself if you think it's anything more than that.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this event. I'd just like to start by first of all introducing myself. My name is Mansoor. I'll be your host for the evening, inshallah. And the four panellists, unfortunately, on the poster couldn't make it today, but we do have four amazing panellists regardless. Abdullah al Andalusi, who's an intellectual activist, and he's the co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. Some of you may have seen him on BBC's Big Question. Salma Yaqub, who graduated from Aston University, yay, and was a former parliamentary candidate and was also part of the Respect Party and has also been a Birmingham City Councillor. There was a lot to say there. And Professor Oliver Sharbrote, who is a Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Birmingham, the Department of Theology and Religion. And finally, last but not least, inshallah. And without further ado, I'd like to start by giving the mic.
Assalamu alaikum. How are you all feeling?
Good.
I always get a nice welcome from Birmingham, but that wasn't like that warmth. You don't seem excited to see me. Assalamu alaikum. I like it. So I'm from originally, but I travelled up from today. And thank you very much for inviting me. I genuinely love coming to Birmingham. And I seem to always come to Aston and like never go to BCU or University of Birmingham for some reason. I'm always busy for them. But alhamdulillah, it's great to be here. And so I wanted to start my talk with addressing something. So those of you that don't know me, don't know anything, but those of you that do know me are probably wondering why the hell I was invited to speak on a panel about being a British Muslim. And I suppose that answer essentially lies in the twists and turns of like the journey of my life. So my story, like many of us, sort of begins before I was born. And like the huge Somali diaspora that you have here in Birmingham, I'm the daughter of Somali refugees who fled war in Somalia and came here for safety and security. And out of all the places my family could have chosen, they chose. And so I was born in a beautiful city. He has this T-shirt there, this guy right here, that says, it's my name, Beth Chan. What are the odds? And that's where I grew up. But then at the age of 10, I came to the UK. And that wasn't essentially an easy transition. And this is my claim to being British, by the way. I've been here for 15 years, was there for 10 years. You do the maths, geniuses. So I came here, essentially, like many young people, not speaking a word of English, and trying very hard to transition in to living in the UK. And again, my parents have really odd choices. Out of all the places they could have chosen to move into, they chose right? Don't ask me. I question every day. And then actually is very diverse. Like if you go into like the city centre, but they chose like a very rural, very like middle class area, right? And so essentially, like my first experiences in the UK was my dad's car being egged. Our neighbours like hating us, like really wanting us to move out. Our door windows were broken quite regularly, and my dad just didn't react. And like my dad is your average Somali dad. Like he reacts. He's like, what? Like he doesn't take rubbish, right? But then when he came to that, he was very like, we have to forget. We have to be better than them. We have to. And I just didn't understand that, and it just riled me up. It made me angry. And also, one of the interesting things when I came to this country is when I decided to wear the hijab. It was the first time I actually wanted to be identified as a Muslim. Because essentially, I was a young black girl who had curly hair, and to anyone else, I didn't look like a Muslim. Especially when there's so many Asians, there's an assumption that there's a correlation between being Asian and being Muslim. You couldn't be African Muslim. So I wanted to be identified as a Muslim. I wanted to feel a part of a community or belonging to something. So I decided to wear the hijab, and I'll never forget my first hate crime as a kid when my hijab was pulled off by a group of girls in school, and I came home and I was very, very upset. And it was times where like, you know how you ladies won't be able to understand. Remember like the hijab that you used to put in, like no pins? So like I hate those hijabs. So I used to steal my mom's hijabs and I'd get pins, right? And I wore that hijab and it was ripped off my head and I had a big cut right here. And my mother went wild. My father didn't react. He was like, we need to have a conversation. And he sat me down and it was a harrowing conversation to have with my father, and somebody that's very, very protective over me. I am like the most important person in this world to him. But for him to be like, I need you to now understand the hijab, like what that hijab, the barriers that will cause for you as a young person, and as an 11-year-old who absolutely hates the UK at this rate. That's a very, very harrowing and difficult conversation to have. And I suppose those experiences and those difficult incidents allow us to draw inspiration from stories that we're all familiar with as Muslims. Stories from Yusuf, Moses, Khadija, Ayub, Isa. And those are like the type of stories that inspired me then to take the situation in what I was in and join community groups and become an advocate for justice. And so regardless of what I did, but regardless of what I achieved in my life, I threw myself into like all kinds of volunteering schemes. I learned that there is nothing I can do or say that will ever allow me to be seen as an equal. And essentially, those rights and those privileges will essentially never be afforded to me. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, Birmingham. It was when my mentor, my now mentor, said to me, and this was what really made me click in my head. They said to me that you don't have the. How many of you actually don't like politics? When you're like, oh, I'm apolitical. Who says that? I'm apolitical, right? Yeah. So actually, and this what really made me click. Like, somebody said to me, you don't have the privilege of being apolitical. The notion of you being a black Muslim woman is a political statement in everyday society. Whatever you do is a representation of your identities. And it's only what you do with that will define you as an individual. And that was actually what made it click. It made me realise that like when I go to the shop to buy milk, it's a political statement right there, you know, buying milk. it's a black Muslim woman buying milk. Do you know what I mean? And essentially, it was the framing around like that those identities mean something in society, right? And it's something that I kept with me and always thought about. So fast forward a couple of years, I ran to be vice president of my students' union, and I then ran to be president of my students' union. And when I was elected as president, if you don't know what a vice president and president of a students' union is, I'm very concerned. You have my like 50 right here. It's a big problem, right? I'm telling you. But it was when I ran as president of my students' union that I faced the first, I suppose, big barrier as a Muslim woman that has claimed now a platform, a political platform, an individual that can now influence people. And like my existence in those spaces were really questioned. Because essentially I was a black Muslim woman in power, right? So on the 1st of July, as the president of the students' union, as an elected vice president of the students' union, of the students' union, I paid the price of being a black Muslim. My name was slandered on probably every right-wing press media outlet that you can think of. My articles were written in several languages, to a point where me and my friends started joking about like, what language do you think is going to publish it next? And I think, but then that of course came with social media abuse, and I had letters and death threats sent to my house. I had journalists knocking at my door, to a point where I was terrified for my family and my siblings. And it was the most difficult time of my life, both physically and mentally, because I think there's one thing being afraid for yourself, but it's even greater being afraid for your family, because essentially it's your actions that are affecting others. So, but I think in that situation itself, there was a very defining moment for me, because I had two options essentially, right? I either walked away and left the entire scenario and did something in what the hell I studied. Like I spent 3 years doing that's why not people. And pick a very simple life, or essentially do something with the situation or the platform that I've been offered, right? But to me, it was actually somebody said to me, and I was so angry when they said this initially, but now it really makes sense. Somebody said to me like don't ever get big-headed. This articles are nothing to do with you. Your face might be plastered on the Daily Mail, on the Mirror, on the Sun. It might be your name, it might be your tweets that they're using, but it's nothing to do with you. It's to do with the fact that you're a black Muslim woman. It's to do with the people that you represent. It's the ability that a Muslim has been able to get to a position where they can influence a students' union, right? It could be anyone in this room right now that could go through the exact same thing. And many people actually have in the movement. And it's when you understand that the platform that I was given had nothing really to do with the fact that, oh, now made it, is now the president, and like the Daily Mail are attacking her specifically. It had nothing to do with me. It had a lot to do with the fact of what we were representing. And when I suppose understood that, is when I really changed vision and really changed the work that I was going to do. I've been given a time warning already. So alhamdulillah, that didn't stop me. If anything, it made my vision crystal clear, more than ever before. But the reality is, as Brexit looms and Trump is lurking, and our government is probably falling apart faster than ever, the scrutiny is higher than ever before on Muslim Brits in the UK. And if I didn't stress this enough earlier, I represent students, and I genuinely believe that young people are our future, are the ones that are going to make the biggest change. But then we can't do that without fighting for our generation first. And we need to do that by leading in our classrooms, in our universities, in our workplaces, in our community places, because essentially that's the only way we're going to be able to change the world. So a little bit on NUS. NUS is the National Union of Students, but more specifically, NUS has done some incredible work, from campaigning on the apartheid in South Africa and in Palestine, and it was massively a part of the succession of ending the investment, the Barclays investment in South African apartheid. And that's one of the most things I'm actually proud of the National Union students, and we still continue to this day to campaign the apartheid in Palestine. But there was, many of you are familiar with FOSIS. A couple of years ago, some incredible individuals from FOSIS took an intervention into NUS, and they said, and essentially because they felt like NUS has not represented the voices of students for many years. And if we talk back then, there were probably like 5-6 Muslim officers across the country, and they intervened and they said, actually, do you know what, our voices aren't being heard, so we need to do something about this. And it's because of those individuals that today we have 65 Muslim officers across the country in Aberdeen University. We have the most ever representation we've had as a national exec in NUS, and essentially why I can be here today, why I can bravely stand here and alhamdulillah, like, those are the individuals that set the path, that take the risks to allow us to be to where we are today. But I kind of think I'm going to leave you with more questions than answers. And I think it comes from the idea of myself as a Muslim woman. Why in society is it that we are viewed as we're incapable of having our own voice? Why is it that misogyny is only a patriarchal issue within Islam, when actually it's what the British Empire is built on? Why is it that Muslim women need to be saved, either be saved by individuals, or you need to be saved from us? And where do those rhetorics come from? I mean, even David Cameron once said, a white man, imagine, that Muslim women are traditionally submissive. I mean, thanks for your experience, David Cameron. Speak your truths, a dodgy day. But the reality is, the media portrays Brits as a certain way, right? And like, I'm not even talking about the Daily Mail or the Sun. I'm talking about like films, theatre, right? The reality is, like, we don't, like, have you ever seen one of those shows where like Muslims just living an ordinary life, like just going to the corner shop? That's not the way we're portrayed, right? And like, why can't Jack in EastEnders just be Bilal, you know, just living his best life? Why? And without there being a twist of like terrorism, like, why can't we talk about normal day, everyday issues about like how difficult university is, for example, in the media, or like why can't we talk about the breakdown of Brexit, which I have a very, very good breakdown on, by the way, probably better than Theresa May's. I mean, anyone does, right? But without it being then linked back to like grooming gangs or honor-based violence, and I think it has a lot to do with the way we allow ourselves to be portrayed, right? And I think sometimes we need to take the initiative and make those changes for ourselves, and question certain things, and not allow yourself to be scooped into an opportunity when it portrays your community in a certain way. Can I finish? Because I feel like you're gonna cut my mic off. But the reality is, right, with every high, there are, with one person's, I'm getting the quote wrong, with our lows, there are highs for others, right? And like, we can't talk about what it's like to be a rich Muslim without recognizing what it's like to be a Muslim in the States right now, who seven countries where people have been banned from completely visiting and seeing their families. We can't talk about being a British Muslim when we have Muslim brothers and sisters in Europe who are being denied to even identify as European. We can't talk about being a British Muslim when we have siblings in China who are being put into concentration camps because they are Muslim. They share the same faith as us. He's really climbing me off, guys.
Just make a final. I'm not.
And essentially, like, we can't talk about being a British Muslim when we have Palestinian brothers and sisters who are being displaced from their homes and being imprisoned in their own land. So the reality is, even though living in this, so the question goes back to the fact that yes, being a British Muslim is probably incredibly difficult, and we have a long, long way to go to tackle issues, but alhamdulillah, we are blessed. And that's what I was going to end with.
For that amazing speech. I don't know what's wrong with the mic. It's not my fault. I didn't do anything to it. I hope the mic doesn't give in. I'm just going to pass on to Professor Oliver Sharbrook from University of Birmingham.
Do I need the mic? It's working at the moment. I think I don't need the mic. I try to avoid it otherwise. Right. I'm going to approach this issue, if I may, more from the perspective of an academic researcher. I mean, I work on Muslim minorities in Europe. I'm editing the Yearbook of Muslims in Europe, which provides an overview of the situation of Muslims in every European country. So I'm hopefully being able to say something about Islam in Britain and maybe draw some comparisons to the situation in other European countries. And in the sort of 10-15 minutes, I want to make 2 points. One point is, I think, very obvious, and my apologies if I'm sort of saying something that is too obvious, that when we talk about being Muslim in Britain, we need to acknowledge the diversity of being Muslim in Britain, you know, the diversity of the Muslim presence, and in the West or in Europe more generally. You know, there's just not one Muslim presence. There's a diversity that manifests itself in various ways. I mean, one very obvious type of diversity is the sort of the ethnic and cultural diversity, sort of representing sort of the parents or grandparents' generation, immigrant background. That is obviously an important factor and shapes the ways how Islam is understood and practiced. And obviously there are also diverse ways of how or what type of Islam is practiced. I mean, obviously we have differences between Sunnis and Shiis, so different understandings, different ways of practicing Islam. We have within Sunni Islam different schools, different approaches, Sufi approaches, Salafism, more political understandings of Islam. So again, there is not just one way in Britain or in Europe to understand and practice Islam. Islam has a long history. It has historically been very diverse. And, you know, these different traditions, these different schools obviously also become manifest in the British context or in the Western context more generally. And because the community is in a minority context and it's fairly small, usually these differences become a bit more pronounced, a bit more articulate, a bit more visible, because different traditions that might not necessarily encounter each other in Muslim majority societies are more exposed to one another in a Muslim minority context. Apart from, you know, the different types of Islam that exist and that create a kind of Islamic religious diversity among Muslims in Britain, we also have, if you like, different levels of religiosity, different ways of engaging and practicing Islam. Again, Muslims who consider themselves Muslims, but, you know, would not necessarily see Islam to be the center of their life. I mean, they might do certain things. They might go to the mosque on Eid or fast during Ramadan for a couple of days. But again, and they would say we are Muslims, but, you know, it's not really the centerpiece of their life. It's not, you know, the aspect of their identity that, you know, is the core of their personal identity. So again, we have different levels of religiosity and so on. And again, the problem is that both academic discourse and also public discourses, you know, focuses very often on people who are very much involved in the communities, very active in the communities. And, you know, maybe the majority of Muslims, yeah, they're sort of involved, but again, not necessarily in such a visible way. And I think there are also other factors of diversity which are perhaps more specific to the British context. I mean, we talk about Muslims in Britain. I wonder whether we're talking about Muslims in England, because if we look at Muslims in Wales and Scotland, I mean, some of these differences came to the fore again through Brexit. I suspect it will come up a bit more often today. You know, the number of Muslims living in Wales or Scotland, for example, who are happy to embrace the label Scottish Muslim, or Welsh Muslim are much higher than the number of Muslims who would say, I'm an English Muslim. I think it's probably a very rare phenomenon. And again, that has to do with the kind of the way that Welsh or Scottish nationalism is constructed, is politically articulated. The major nationalist party in Scotland, the SNP, develops a kind of inclusive, multicultural understanding of Scottish national identity. There's a very sort of anti-imperialist element, maybe also anti-English element to the way how Welsh or Scottish nationalism is constructed. And I think it also has to do, and I'll come back to this later, to class. I mean, when we look at the sort of the social demographics of Muslims in Scotland, the majority of them are actually, middle upper class Muslims. So the kind of the social composition, the socioeconomic backgrounds of Muslims in Scotland, for example, tend to be a bit different to the majority of socioeconomic backgrounds of Muslims living in England. I want to sort of speak briefly, and we had this already, about three variables that are not always considered. I mean, one in particular, and these, when it comes to talking about Muslims in the West more generally, and these are sort of race, gender, and class. And again, to sort of illustrate that the experiences are different. If you're a white Muslim convert or a male white Muslim convert, your experience of being a Muslim in Britain will be different to somebody who is of a different racial background. Again, illustrated, the experience of a female Muslim will be different to a male Muslim. But I think one aspect that very often is overlooked entirely in public debates around the Muslim presence in Britain is the issue of class. And the social exclusion that many Muslims feel. I mean, I think there was a study published last year saying that 50% of Muslims in Britain live in the 10% least, poorest urban areas in the UK, sort of the most socioeconomically deprived urban areas in the UK, which obviously has implications in terms of access to education, access to medical care, again, generally sort of facilitating social mobility. And I think class, social exclusion is an element that is, I think, extremely important and usually not paid sufficient attention, at least in public debates and in academic debates as well, when it comes to Muslim minorities in the West. So, I mean, what I want to suggest is, the diversity. I think the message got across, and sort of the idea that, I mean, there is a very famous African American feminist, Kimberly Crenshaw, who uses the term intersectionality. There was, for her as a kind of an African American black woman, there was a sense that the way how feminist discourses had been constructed by white feminists, it sort of doesn't reflect her own experience. And she said, we need to look at the different elements, the different layers of a person's identity. And that obviously, for her, obviously, as a feminist, it was important to sort of be able to articulate her experience as a woman, her sort of experience of gender discrimination. But I think we can apply that generally, that with every community, with every individual, we have different identities intersecting with one another. There are different layers of one's identity, and you can be different things, and you are different things at the same time. Which can be maybe sometimes frustrating, but also I think there is perhaps also a certain playfulness around this. I mean, my wife, for example, she's a Palestinian who grew up in Germany, so she knows perfectly well how to behave, how to talk in an Arab Muslim environment. That's kind of the cultural etiquette. But she's obviously very comfortable, being in a Western, she's also an accomplished academic, Western academic context. And, I think, people are concerned about having sort of different simultaneous identities, whatever, but I think there are also certain advantages around it in terms of being able to relate to communities and to talk to audience at the same time in different contexts. Now, the other point that I want to mention is perhaps a bit more, well, I hope I can get it across. Well, the first one was a bit more obvious, is that what we can observe, I mean, what research have observed, looking at what's happening around Muslim minorities in Europe more generally, is there's sort of two apparently contradictory processes happening. On the one hand, we have what we might call a normalization of Muslim life in British society. So the increasing visibility of Islam in British society, in European societies more generally, from mosques and religious institutions, Islamic societies on university campuses and so on. Britain obviously has, quite unique compared to other European countries, a very, very strong Muslim civil society. Again, so this is a way of how Muslims can lobby for issues and causes that are important to them, and create a momentum around these sort of issues. And Muslims are also increasingly visible in public life, in politics, in culture, in media, in sports, and obviously in a kind of celebrity-driven culture. This is important to have people of a Muslim background who have prominent roles within these different areas of public life. So there are all these trends suggesting that sort of Islam has become part of the mainstream, is sort of part of European societies. At the same time, we see, and referred to this already, the reverse trend. Those kind of political perception of Islam as a potential security threat, as something alien, sort of efforts by European governments to sort of domesticate Islam, to sort of create forms of Islam that are sort of docile, that don't pose a perceived threat, that don't challenge mainstream values within society, and again being actively involved in organizing communities and organizations, governing, monitoring, surveilling communities using different ways. And of course, as I've also mentioned, we see the rapid rise of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim racism, as part of the wider rise in Western societies of right-wing populism. So, the rise of political actors that sort of present Islam as a threat to European identity and civilization, question the place of Islam and Muslims in Europe. So both processes seem to be contradictory. On the one hand, Islam is increasingly accepted, Muslims are visible in public life, they're active politically in all sorts of areas, and, certain group of people feel very relaxed about this, see that as something positive. And on the other hand, the rise of Islamophobia, xenophobia, racism, and so on. But what we have said, that actually both, my view is that both processes are linked. That because Muslim life is increasingly sort of mainstreamed, normalized, the sort of the otherness, the religious, cultural difference of Muslims is increasingly accepted and accommodated for, people get nervous around this, and revert to sort of simplistic, monolithic identities, a sense of pure European identity, whatever that may, or pure Britishness, sort of a nostalgia for past when, the society wasn't that diverse, that complex. So I think, it is also a response to this. The world is becoming more complex, you encounter different worldviews, and sort of people retreat to very singular, very simplistic religious identity. So that is, I think, the sort of the processes we see, and obviously that creates problems because it suggests that it doesn't matter how much Muslims try to integrate, contribute to society, their otherness is always there as a potential marker that marks them as outsiders. And again, we've seen this in European history in the 20th century, where communities who've known each other very well, who lived together, suddenly became enemies and fought against one another. So I think that's sort of the challenge we are facing at the moment. Something very positive happening, but I think the backlash is potentially dangerous. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Oliver, for an insightful speech. I like how he mentioned Muslim celebrities. A certain Mohammed Salah comes to mind. He plays for one of the best football teams in England. May Allah grant Liverpool victory in the Premier League, inshallah. And without further ado, I'd like to pass on to Salman Yaqub, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. I have to stand up to speak because otherwise I've got a really quiet voice even with the mic. It's been precisely 22 years, I realised as I walked into Aston University today, since I've been back. I know this because my son is 22 years this year, so I studied here. I was born in Bradford, but my family moved to Birmingham when I was a little baby, about 1 year old, and I consider myself obviously very Brummie. We grew up initially in Alum Rock. Forget Jenny on the Rock, Sally on the Rock. And when my sister, who's 3 years older than me, passed the grammar test, we moved to King's Heath, so we became middle class overnight, apparently. And I went to Camp Hill, and then I came here. This shows how old I am, because I'm like the first generation born here from my parents who came from Pakistan. And at that time, there wasn't a culture of girls going to uni. And the biggest fear then, as my Chacha, who came round to warn my dad, was she's going to run off with a white guy. And so, you know, you don't allow your daughters to go to uni. And obviously true in your case.
Absolutely.
Your wife. And I remember I literally showed my dad, who, mashallah, had a deep love for our deen and inculcated those values in us. Literally showing the hadith about education and girls. And so he couldn't argue with the Quran or the Sunnah, so he reluctantly allowed us to go to university. My sister went to Birmingham Uni, and she's a doctor now. And I came to Aston because my place for medical school was in London, and it was like, you can go to uni, but you ain't going to be leaving home to go to uni. And I applied to come to Aston and to use my science A-levels at that time, and I did chemical engineering and human biology combined honours. And it was so boring. And I thought, these are supposed to be the best years of my life, right, so far, that after that I actually did a degree in human and applied psychology here. Because I was really jealous. Every time we had exams and I'd see my friends who were on the psychology course, thinking, that's so interesting. And that's what I did. I got married. I did a postgrad in integrative psychotherapy, which I loved. And I started having my kids. So all of that happened. Just to recap a bit, whilst I was at uni, because I was talking to some of the sisters, and it struck me seeing, just even coming and seeing this, to put it into context, when I was at Aston, I was the only person on campus with a hijab. Can you imagine that now? I started to wear my hijab whilst I was at school, because I used to attend some study circles, and I became convinced from Islamic point of view at that young age. And even my family were kind of against it, although, as explained, it was a traditional practicing family, but it was like, oh, you just want to be an Arab, and, you know, what's wrong with the Buddha when you just, you know, we have other weddings and whatnot. But other than that, it's a bit extreme, right? So my commitment to the faith was actually a hard-won one, because even before I wore the hijab, my journey to it was because I hadn't liked Islam, or what I thought was Islam, and I saw double standards when it came to how boys and girls were treated in the families and all the rest of it. And I remember reading the Bible and the Torah and reading Buddhism and all sorts of things, and a lot of questioning. And I remember I was so kind of impacted when I actually read the Quran in English for the first time. And I was like, damn, this is the right faith. So it was almost like, I can't argue with that. And beyond that, you know, the love for it and the strength I got from it, and I pray to Allah that I maintain that love, because I don't take it for granted that we are all tested in many, many ways. So coming to uni, being the only person in hijab, at that time there wasn't an Islamic society. I founded the Islamic Society here, and set up at that time Birmingham University, Wolverhampton, Warwick, and it was all new, you know, like I probably had the zeal of a convert, you know when you have that passion for the deen. And so I didn't have the context of 9/11 and all that post-world that you guys have faced, but But there were the usual stereotypes about Muslims and Muslim women. And I always felt that thing about you've got to kind of be the best to prove that, just to even get a hearing. So I remember when I was at the labs, I spent most of my time here in the labs, it was like, oh, your scarf might be a health hazard and, you shouldn't be wearing it. At that time, being a traditional Pakistani girl, my hair was like way down there, thinking, no, that would be a lot more of a health hazard. So just those kind of patronising attitudes were there, but I didn't allow that to kind of faze me. And building up from scratch, this sisterhood, this brotherhood, was an amazing experience. And I'm so, so proud coming back and seeing this. Well done, you guys, especially with the world that you have grown up in, because you have known nothing else. I feel kind of sorry for you. You don't know a world where being Muslims was not this big political thing. I'm not surprised a lot of Muslims are kind of turned off politics because it's so sick of it. But as pointed out, we don't have a choice. Being apolitical is political. In fact, they want us to be apolitical. But that's their politics. I'll come on to what I mean by that. But just to continue my journey, having been to Aston and now then to BCU, I was doing my PhD at Birmingham University, so I was doing the whole rounds. I actually was a SWAT. I liked studying. And it was a theology department. I was starting a PhD in spiritual and social aspects of the self, because I was fascinated by the idea of Islamic psychology and what certain concepts in Islam meant for us, both in a spiritual way and a political way, which was ignored in the mainstream psychology. So that's how I started off. Then 9/11 happened. And I thought somebody sensible was going to say the right thing. Because suddenly it was, you're either with us or against us. George Bush said it, Tony Blair said it, they started to discuss bombing Afghanistan. And even then, as a young mum, I thought, how is bombing more innocent people going to help those people who lost their lives and their loved ones in New York? And how is it going to actually not mean more deaths and a spiral of violence? And I thought, I'm not a political person, but I can see this is rubbish. And I waited for some politicians to say it. I didn't hear it. I waited for the mosque leaders to say it. I didn't hear it. And so I was one of the people who initially, very nervously, went along to what was very new then, a Stop the War Coalition kind of founding meeting, very small. And out of nowhere I was elected. And I thought, I don't know how to do this. And I remember doing my very first speech in Birmingham City Centre, and I was literally shaking, and I wrote out every word. And I asked myself, what are you nervous about? What is making you feel so scared about speaking up? And when I was really honest, I thought, I don't want to look like an idiot. Like I don't know what I'm talking about. And I thought, that's your nafs. That's your ego. And if you can overcome that, you can be a voice for people who do not have a voice right now. And that is far, far more important than looking like an idiot, if that happens. And it was that sense of responsibility, because the topic here is British and Muslim. And to be honest, I'm going to kind of almost ignore it in some ways, because I'm a bit sick of it myself. So I'm just going to talk about experiences from my point of view, but also leave you with something, I hope, in a positive way. I don't know. Shall I just... can you hear me if I speak without it? Yeah. Because that's bugging me now, the interference. So, going into the public domain and actually criticising British foreign policy. Now it might not seem that difficult, but it was a very, very controversial space. Immediately it was like, you're the traitor, you must be a supporter of Al-Qaeda. Yeah. All of that was, a very, very constant thing. I remember my dad, bless him, I was talking about him. He was like, Salma, this is not the time for us to speak up. We're guests in this country, and they're very angry at the moment, and you don't want to provoke people. And that's when I thought, no, actually, you might have felt like you were a guest, but this is where I'm born, and this is where my kids are born. And I'm not saying this just as a Muslim, I'm saying this as a citizen. I don't want my taxes to be paying for bombs, to be killing other people abroad. And also, if we're going to go talk about as a Muslim, the Quran says very clearly, stand up for justice, even if it goes against yourself or your parents, be they rich or poor. And I literally, again, showed my dad this verse, and he goes, it's as if I've read it for the first time. Because I say all this, but these values actually came from my parents. Because when we were little, they had talked to us about these things. And I think it probably bugged them that we were kind of throwing it back at them. But that's how it was. That people felt silenced, and it was not our place. But I'll kind of fast forward. From a very small group, we had to meet in churches and school halls because the mosques were terrified. You know, all this stuff about radical mosques. Yeah. Absolute nonsense. The imams are the first ones who are terrified. You know, they don't want to talk politics, right? But as more and more people came on board, the confidence grew. And it became actually the biggest protest movement in 2,000 years of British history. And I'm really, really proud of that. And it was not just a Muslim response. And in a way, some of the thinking I'd done, as when I was starting my PhD, I had to abandon it because it was like the activism. I was also working as a psychotherapist and had young kids, so the PhD, which I loved, had to kind of just be on standhold. But ironically, it was those concepts which guided me. Concepts like stand up for justice. Concepts like my relationship with my Lord is a personal one, but my duty and responsibility to enact my faith, there is a social and political responsibility. Not from a tribal point of view. My people are not just the Muslims. My people is all people. And my line is, I'm on the side of the oppressed, whether they're Muslim or not, black or white, man or woman. And I'm against the oppressor, whether they happen to be Muslim, or whether they're not Muslim, or whether they happen to be women, or they happen to be men. And this gives me a certain clarity, because I believe that's about fitrah. That understanding that as a Muslim we have, that every single human being is created with that innate, natural desire for goodness. Yes, we all have evil inclinations, and again, no one's above that, including me. That's why we all have to guard against and not kid ourselves about our own kind of thing. So I don't believe people are all evil or people are all good. We're created with the potential for both. But how do we use our time on this earth? Because you've been put here. You've been created. That spark of life. You're eternal beings walking on a finite and limited time frame in this particular form on this rock called Earth. But our time will be up. And what will matter is what we did with that time. The most precious resource we have actually is not our money or our houses or our degrees or what social media and how many likes we have. It's who we really are and what we do with our time. And that's a gift that all of us have. And none of us is better or less. And it's the one resource that can never come back. You can lose your riches, but you can make them up again. You cannot bring time back. So don't think, and this is again something I had to remind myself and my parents, because my mom, bless her, she was like, but your children are young, and and your house isn't paid off. So again, the Quran doesn't say stand up for justice when you're middle-aged, and when you've got your house, and when your kids are grown up, and when you've got a great job.
Financially stable.
And all that stuff about finances. Stand up for justice. And have that trust in Allah. And the result for us, and I'm going to talk again about this mind space, this psychological space, and this is part of my message to you in terms of how powerful you are. Because it's easy to kind of see yourself as victims, right? And yet, it's rubbish. There's a lot of crap out there. But I'm going to tell you some good news. We're here, actually, not to be reactive. We're here to be proactive. Because we have got something so strong and so powerful which no other power on this earth can impact, should we not let it. Because if we truly believe that we are connected to Allah, and we believe in the Quran, right? And Allah tells us He's closer to us than our jugular vein. He's here right now with each and every one of us. And he's the one who decides. He could make everything perfect in 1 second. He could destroy everything in 1 second. It's not what we do so much, it's his plan. It's our efforts. That is a success or failure. And sometimes when we see the material success, we can get happy about it. Let's celebrate those successes, but let's not get lost in them. In the same way, when what looks like apparent failure, just like the Prophet ﷺ faced many challenges, we believe he was the best of mankind. But did he have an easy life? Did all the people accept him and say, yeah, you're right? The whole of his seerah is about these struggles. And that's our test. And you're here to give a positive message. So right here in Birmingham, whilst you're students, what are you doing to make this university a good place? What are you doing to make this city a good place? Because you've got a lot to contribute. And don't ever think that you're any less than, I'm going to be a bit crude, than the male, stale, pale leadership, unfortunately, that is subjected on us, because it doesn't reflect this future now. The future is multicultural. The future is you. The future is diverse. We should be proud of what we're bringing, because we're bringing solutions. We're bringing positivity, and we're bringing that empathy. So I hope that you'll go away from this meeting tonight feeling energized, empowered, strengthened, and get behind Jeremy Corbyn.
For that, especially the last bit, if you guys didn't hear it. I enjoyed your speech as a politics student myself as well. It was good to hear that. And I enjoyed the mention of your sibling going to University of Birmingham and you going to Aston, because Aston is obviously better. My sister's right there, she goes to UOB, but we'll welcome her today. It's fine. And just moving on to the final panelist, Brother Abdullah al Andalusi. I'm not sure if the mic is working.
He doesn't need
my
a
voice.
mic.
I'll just.
I need the mic for myself.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. I greet you with Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'll be your designated troublemaker for this evening. Now, usually how I generally approach topics, and I like to have precision in meaning and definition to kind of resolve these discussions. So, unfortunately, I won't be able to offer you much rhetoric or kind of great oratory, but I can promise you some very clear and sharp, albeit dry, definitions and solutions, and perhaps even a conclusion to the question of being British and Muslim. So can you be British and Muslim? Well, let's ask some, I suppose more deep questions. You can only resolve this question if you understand 3 points. 1, what is the context of this debate, the context of this discussion? 2, what's the definition of terms? It's always down to definition of terms in most things. And 3, what's the basis for our perspective as Muslims? So let's look at the context. You see it constantly, and constantly there's endless forums, discussions, Muslims setting up conferences about being British and Muslim, mutually backslapping each other to say, yes, I'm British, I'm more British, I'm even more British, to try to get some kind of acceptance from certain powers that be. And the context of this is an age-old discussion in Europe on the loyalty of its minorities. And it didn't start with Muslims. In England specifically, there was discussions as to, can Catholics be truly loyal to the country because their head of their religion is a foreign head of state? So how can we ever trust Catholics to be loyal to this country? Then it moved on to discussion on Jews. Can Jews be loyal to this country? And I will bring a conservative MP, so you'll probably enjoy this discussion, a conservative MP to show the kind of anti-Semitism that was very prevalent back in early 20th century, not just in Germany, all different countries, like Henry Ford in America, the industrialist, big anti-Semite, and of course a tract which I could argue is quite anti-Semitic to a degree perhaps, by Winston Churchill, called Zionism versus Bolshevism, where he contrasted national Jews versus international Jews. So national Jews were good Jews who were loyal to their country, and international Jews were Jews who had some loyalty to a greater international movement, which he described as a world conspiracy. You see that anti-Semitism in his discussion? Yeah, a Conservative Party member who's now kind of glorified by many people as the greatest Brit, kind of was a person who reiterated typical anti-Semitic tropes about world conspiracies. Right? Like all to do with the distrust of minorities and whether minorities can be loyal or not. And of course, let's quote a modern Conservative Party member, David Cameron, former head of the Conservative government, or former Prime Minister rather. So he said, for example, just in 2015, he said, "It is a worry for the world that some feel allegiance only to a religious brotherhood instead of their fellow citizens in nation states." And what Winston Churchill, who talked about Jews, and David Cameron and Theresa May et al. Said about Muslims, there has some strange parallels. One, a concern that the particular religious minority has a greater affiliation to each other or to a greater movement beyond the state. Two, that there are good members of that minority who are defined as those who are nationalist or patriotic to their state. And three, the duty of those good members of that minority to combat the internationalist members of their minority. And that you see that with in the same discourse of David Cameron. In that same speech, he talked about the duty of good Muslims who don't subscribe to those views to combat the views of those who are, internationalist Muslims, should we say? Or he called it Islamists, basically. So we see a recurring theme there, unfortunately, with xenophobia of minorities. What about people saying, well, surely isn't it not concerned that someone's religion should trump their loyalty to a state? But the reason why I say this is due to actually a concern over the loyalty of minorities is because, as Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the second to the head of the religion of the state religion of this country, which is obviously the Anglican Church, obviously the Queen being the head of state and the head of the religion, he pointed out to a Conservative MP as well, the argument that if someone believes that their religion is more important than the state, or their conscience is more important than the state, they're an extremist. Justin Welby said, well, you have an extremist right here because I believe that the kingdom of God is greater than the rule of law. Right? And of course, he won't be condemned. Why? Oh, because he's not a minority. Even though his beliefs, if said by myself or any other Muslim or others in the past, would be condemned as like, oh, look, we can't trust these people. But Justin Welby says it, oh, that's okay. Even though it's exactly the same concept. No difference. And also look at this, despite the fact that Muslims in regular surveys come out and say that they are more prone to identifying as British than even the quote-unquote, the natives or the indigenous population or what have you. So Muslims outdo English people in identifying themselves as British. Certainly more than the Scots as well, who almost half of them voted to leave Britain in that last referendum, let's not forget. But of course, no worrying about loyalty for them, no concerns about loyalty among Scots. And even Jehovah's Witnesses, many in this country who are obviously majority are going to be English, let's just say, they don't believe in political participation or even voting because they believe that's not their world or their dominion of their religion is not in the political world of men, and therefore they don't care so much about political engagement. No one says we need to get more Jehovah's Witnesses to vote. No one says that. But they say that about Muslims, right? Why? Oh, because they're worried about your loyalty. So let's go for a definition of terms. And I'm not going to start with what it means to be British. I'm going to start with what it means to be Muslim, or definition, perhaps. So what is a Muslim? Well, in essence, someone that submits to the creator of the universe, the creator of everything, and makes no other higher reference point other than God, makes no partners or rivals to God in this. And a Muslim who submits to God submits to his commands and human purpose, the purpose of that mankind was made in the first place. Or to those of you who are SJWs, people kind. As for the basis for our perspective as Muslims, we're commanded to do justice, mercy, and be witnesses to mankind of the truth, with Islam defining what mercy and justice is, in essence, giving to people what they deserve, what they need, rather than some simple balancing equation of everything must be 100% equal, which obviously if you take it to its nth degree, you become communist. But that's not what it is. The definition is giving to people what is due their rights. So then what is British? Well, what really can't be defined, and the reason why it can't be defined, and no one ever dares define it, is because it's not really about a label or the definition, it's about loyalty, and it always has been. And you're fooling yourself if you think it's anything more than that. And if you look in history, that's always been the question. The day they actually define what Britishness is as a fixed definition, then that's the day that any country, when they define the national character of their country, that's when they become fascist. Because fascist means that people must adhere to something greater than themselves for the state of the nation than the individual. That's the definition of fascism. So when the Germans decide to define that to be a German you must be X, Y, and Z, and anyone who's not acting that way is therefore a traitor to being German or is anti-German, then they get viewed as the enemy of the state. Which is why actually a lot of people don't want, Muslim or non-Muslim, many people don't want Britishness to be defined by the state. They are concerned. So what is nationalism? Well, let's ask a few questions about this. I like to adopt the kind of character of, in this sense, of Socrates in Athens, who started to question all the values of Athens from a philosophical perspective, saying that you just believe these ideas, I want to question them. And of course, ultimately he irritated them and they executed him by democratic vote. So that was one of the first democracies, what he did to some of its thinkers. They also tried to execute Aristotle, but he left Athens before they could get him, or at least before they could prosecute him anyway. So, is nationalism or Britishness, let's just term a national label. So is nationalism something that you label yourself with? Well, it's not really a choice, because if that's the case, then someone in Zimbabwe could say, I'm British, and then instantly become British. And if you're an illegal immigrant, you can just say, I'm British. Oh, damn it, that person's called himself British. Now we have to recognize them as such. No, it's not what you label yourself as, and clearly you should ask Shamina Begum if it really is something that is defined by purely what you label yourself as, because other people seem to be able to decide that for you. And of course, if you define nationalism by what is labeled by others, so what others label you rather, then why care what other people think about you in the first place? If it's what the government defines you as, then, well, the government giveth and the government taketh away, right? If basically Sajid Javid in his Home Office position, as in the Home Office, can take away your citizenship, then what point is there of being British if it purely is his decision? That's what it's defined as, Sajid Javid's decision. What about, is it love of a geographical area? Well, no, you could go see the Atlas Mountains in Morocco or the Pyrenees and find it really beautiful without becoming instantly Moroccan or what have you, right? So people come here on holiday, enjoy some of the geographic locations they find here. Doesn't mean now that they become British. Obeying the laws of the land. Well, even foreigners and visitors have to obey the laws of the land. So how does that make you more British than a foreigner or a visitor, or someone who lives here for a long time but is not a citizen of this country? Let's say that they're from France or Poland or what have you. What about love of the non-moral aspects of culture, like love of food, clothing and language? Well, if it's just love of food and clothing, and yet in Britain a famous pastime is curry, what does that mean then exactly? So are you then Indian? Do you become, or Pakistani or what have you? If it's language, then speaking English, does that make you English? If that's the case, then is everyone in the United States of America English as well, or British, because they speak the English language? Or South Africa as well, because it's the official language there. If it's being the inheritor of a cultural origin, history, usually linked to an ethnic group, because that's usually cultural origin of who, then that means you can never be British unless you are a direct descendant of the people which are doomed to be indigenous population of this island. I always like to have some fun and say, what, Welsh? Because the Welsh are the First Nations of this country, and the Cornish, and well, the Scots are really immigrating from North Ireland ultimately, but before them was the Picts. But anyway, I digress. The Anglo-Saxons are actually the invaders of this country from Germany and Scandinavia. No offense to you, he's German, but so who sets the deadline? It says, who sets the limit, saying, oh no, okay, now anyone who's invaded after this, or who immigrates after this, now that's wrong, but up until that point, yeah, you're now native, right? It's arbitrary. And if it's just about inheritance, cultural inheritance of an ethnic group, that's the basis for racism, and why racism is always linked to nation states. People keep getting bogged down in the idea of, oh, it's linked to the skin tone. So, it's always skin tone whiteness, and they use the term white a lot. But I've known Syrians who are white, Iranians who are white, Pakistanis who are white. Do they have white culture, white identity? Because their melanin levels are the same as roughly a Northern European? No. It's because any nation state If you base a state on a nation, then it's the representative of a nation, and which nation, whose nation. And usually the argument is, well, it was the nation of the inheritors of a cultural origin. And that's why racism and nationalism have always been connected in every country, every nation state, not just England or France or United States or what have you. Okay. Is it pride in an affiliation? Well, what makes you be able to have pride in affiliation? You didn't, like you say, Shakespeare did some great works. Yeah, but did you do some great works? If you ask the average EDL member, they're much more far removed from Shakespeare, certainly in their mastery of the English language, than even most immigrants. So that's a whole different thing. That's a whole different discussion. If you see your group affiliation, then is what makes you British, is that you see the group affiliation of Britishness as more important than any other human beings around the world, or justice, or God, or religion. Then how is that moral, ethical, even by any standards, not just Islamic standards, but any standards? So I should say arbitrarily, this group of people are morally more important than any other human being. That I don't think anyone would agree with that being moral or ethical. So then what is the Islamic perspective? The Islamic perspective is that you're not allowed to have pride in anything. Anyone who has, as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, anyone who has a mustard seed of pride in their hearts can't enter paradise, or won't enter paradise. What about people who condemned? Some Arabs made a joke towards Bilal and Suhaib al-Rumi, and they were saying these are foreigners, and the Prophet Muhammad reacted angrily to them. He said, your father is the same and your religion is the same, and the Arabism of which you seem to be proud belongs neither to your father nor to your mother. And then he declared, he who propagates the creed of Asabiyya, nationalism or tribal solidarity, or who fights for it or offers his life for it, is not one of us. So what does that mean? So then what would be the Islamic perspective? What could we say about this to finish up? Which is quite simple. The definition, I think, is the Islamic one, the one that has been used in the ancient world, and the one that we can use is if you define yourself as British, meaning that you were describing your background, that you were born and raised, and that in a society defined by a particular label, and that helped form and mold your formative years, then that's an acceptable label. Then you could say you're British then, because Suhaib al-Rumi, Suhaib wasn't even Roman. He was just an Arab who was captured by the Romans. But because he had grown up amongst them, Arabs called him a Rumi. What about Salman al-Farsi? Salman the Persian, right? Because he was Persian. He was raised amongst Persians, but that didn't prevent him from obviously being or supporting the Caliph Umar in his campaigns against the Persians who were committing injustice. Right? He didn't say, "Well, I'm Persian. I can't side against the Persian Empire." He said, "No," because he sided for the cause of justice. So really, he was only defined by. If you want to keep that description, it only means your background. That's it. It has no moral obligations. It has no moral significances. The only moral significance you should have as a Muslim is that you submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore you are one of the Muslims. And that is the only label. And in the ancient world, people didn't really define their morality by labels to nation. They defined their morality by labels to their religion, because religion informs much more of your character than the arbitrary nature of being born somewhere. So, circle.
Jazakallah, Brother Abdullah, for that very insightful speech. So what we're going to do now is, I have some general questions that we're going to ask each of the panelists to go through. Hopefully they'll only take 2 to 3 minutes. Please. And then after that we will also give questions to the floor as well, because I'm sure you guys are raring to ask questions. So firstly, I'd like to ask, do you believe we are currently living in a truly multicultural society? And how do you believe Muslims should respond to the idea that our religion is incompatible with the Western values, which is an idea that is constantly peddled by the alt-right? So, Abdullah, if you'd like to go first.
On that. I'll just predict my voice again. So do we live in a truly multicultural society? What it means, well, it depends what you mean by that. So if they say, we live in a multicultural society, but everyone must adopt certain values, that's not really then truly multicultural, because all you're just saying is, all by multicultural you just mean different foods being offered by different restaurants, And you can wear different clothes if you like. Well, up to an extent in certain Western countries, like in France, so you can't wear niqab in public and hijab in schools. But certainly, I would say that as long as this government continues to argue that Muslims are not fine just to remain within the law, but they have to adopt values on top of that they have to profess, otherwise they're not truly welcome here. As long as the government says this and continues to say this, then it's not really a multicultural society. It's a unicultural society that just allows variation in food and clothing styles to some extent. As for that question with regards to the idea of integration, what do you believe constitutes adequate integration? And it's the one on the Western. Oh, you jumped to that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So Western values. Well, Western values have always changed. I mean, I could argue that Muslims were more in line with Western values during the Victorian era, when there was a lot of Christian kind of based morality, for example. So I think the better question is really, what is really Western values? And if so, does something have moral weight just because it happens to be, let's say, the majority take? Considering that Westerners don't all agree on everything. Right? There are some very kind of strong Christians out there that really disagree with liberals on many things and actually agree more with us. Are they no longer Western, even though they're indigenous, quote unquote, or Anglo-Saxons, or whatever you want to define that the ethnic group as? Of course, that's the point, isn't it? If you are perceived to be indigenous, you can have difference of opinion. You can disagree with liberalism if you want. Because that's just your view. Liberalism with a small L, the philosophy called liberalism. That's part of your view. That's fine. But if you're someone who's from a minority or deemed to be the children of foreigners, then you can't. That's being not loyal to the country, and that's why you could say. It depends how you define racism, but that's an implied racism in a way. I don't like using the term racism because we're all part of the human race, and I think it's a kind of a relic word from our past, but you get my understanding of that term. Basically, ethnic sectarianism, let's just say, for want of a better term. So I think that'll be my response to that.
Salma, it's the first and the fourth, sorry, I combined them.
Well, I agree with much of what Brother Abdullah says, so I won't repeat that. But coming on to the specific challenges now, do we live in multicultural Britain? Yes. Is it still a pluralistic society? Yes. Are those values coming under attack? Yes. And is Europe becoming more and more intolerant? Yes. These are dangerous times. The far right is on the march. The far right in the 20th century, had a very clear enemy, the Jewish community, and we know what happened then. So there is a direct link between political rhetoric and physical violence. And so we can't be complacent about that. In France, the National Front came second in the elections. In Hungary, we have a leader who is both openly anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. In Poland, we've seen tens and thousands of people marching, saying we don't want any Muslims and kill Muslims. So this has become very, very open now. In this country, at least lip service-wise, people like Tommy Robinson are considered outside the mainstream. But, and my argument would be, that our so-called mainstream politicians, especially in the Tory party, have created a climate where actually Islamophobia is not just acceptable, but is actually used quite regularly and in an institutionalised manner. And for that, we need to be alert and fight back with our allies. So we can't be complacent about that, but at the same time, I would say don't take it personally. This is geopolitics. I grew up at a time when the black community in the 1980s were the druggies, the robbers, the violent others. Us Muslim Asians, because the majority of Muslims in this country happen to come from certain parts of the world, were the good families, had good values, behaved themselves, stuck to the law. Now Muslims, are the other, and anything that happens, whether it's grooming, paedophilia, domestic violence, it's a Muslim issue. But that, for me, is directly linked to the war on terror. When you justify killing and dehumanising hundreds and thousands, indeed millions of people abroad, part of that is you dehumanise that same minority in this country. And just one other point I want to add, it's not just about being a minority. It's being about minority, whether you support certain political views or not. So the Jewish community is a really interesting example. So we had Winston Churchill, who condemned the Zionists in his time, and in fact, virulent anti-Semitism. The same Daily Mail was there saying the same things about Jewish communities as it's now saying about Muslims. But now, the political climate is such that the Zionists are the acceptable Jews, and you have anti-Zionist Jews who are considered beyond the pale. So the Jewish people who stand up, for Jeremy Corbyn, for Muslims, for left-wing politics, they're considered not belonging, and now the loyalty test is the other way around. So it's about which minority is acceptable at different times, and that is always about where it ties in with power. And so Islamophobia is interesting. Like with Saudi Arabia, you will not see them condemn Saudi Arabia as a country. Its human rights record is obvious. Its dealings with women is obvious. It's absolutely disgusting. I say this as a Muslim, so it's not Islamophobic to condemn Saudi Arabia. Yet our country is very comfortable in giving £5 billion worth of arms. They're killing hundreds and thousands of Yemenis with our money. So they won't condemn them. They'll side with ISIS, with Sisi in Egypt. They will side with the oppressors. So it's just about being the wrong kind of Muslim if you challenge the status quo, and that's when you feel the Islamophobic backlash.
Right. Yes, I'm not quite sure whether I have much to add. I mean, in terms of the first question, it depends on how we define and what we understand with multiculturalism. I mean, as a social reality, yes, we live in a multicultural society. I mean, you just need to walk on the street and see cultural diversity. So it's social reality, whether people like it or not, or whether it makes people feel uncomfortable. There's obviously the kind of the normative understanding, the political understanding of multiculturalism as a policy, as a social policy that, it's a sort of responsibility of the state, of society to protect the rights of minorities, to ensure they can maintain their religious and cultural identity, to facilitate the preservation of their identity. And obviously there has been a major backlash in the last sort of 10, 15 years against this, as sort of the notion that multiculturalism has failed, it has led to ghettoization and so on. And I suppose, I mean, people who support multiculturalism, I think there needs to be some sort of critical engagement with multiculturalism, because one of the dangers, despite the sort of the positive intentions about respecting diversity, allowing the preservation of one's identity, multiculturalism as a kind of political program, as a political project, contains the danger of objectifying particular religious and cultural identity. So this is the Muslim community. This is what they believe. This is what they do. This person is the representative of this community. And the actual diversity, or this is the Sikh community, or whichever community, the actual internal diversity, the actual sort of issues, dynamics within the community are very often not recognized. I mean, one obvious issue with the kind of traditional approach to multicultural politics that it sort of ratifies, it sort of strengthens traditional patriarchal leadership of male elites within particular communities.
I disagree with that, and I'm happy to engage with that.
So I think, we need to accept as reality, but as a political project, I think some discussion needs to be happening on this. I think the problem is those who criticize it, they are pushing forward an assimilationist agenda. So they confuse integration with assimilation. They want to get rid of sort of public articulations, the public presence of difference altogether. The second point, I mean, again, as Abdullah said, it's about deconstructing this question. I mean, it's a flawed question, so it's always a challenge to respond to an inherently flawed question. And it's sort of deconstructing the question. I suppose what is meant with Western values is sort of progressive, liberal, secular sentiments. So again, the notion, we are for gender equality, we support gay rights, we are, religion, we are secular, religion is not really important. That's sort of what is understood with Western values. Yeah. And again, it's about deconstructing the sort of the underlying assumptions behind, what is seen as Western values, and again, to historicize, to put it in historical context and see that, many of these values that are taken for granted and are sort of expected from again, quite recent and, a very recent phenomenon in Western societies.
So I can give you a minute to just, voice your disagreement if you'd like.
For me, the filter is power dynamics. I understand what you're saying about how diversity can get overlooked, but that's not the problem of multiculturalism. That's the problem of how it's manipulated. I'll give you a very concrete example. In local politics here, whether it's Conservative or Labour, when they want to harvest votes, they'll go to the Brotherly leader, right? Now, that's not because of community's fault. That is a typical kind of colonial mentality. Yes. Take me to your leader and deliver for me. And then communities get kind of saying, oh, well, you know, we've got these community leaders who are speaking, but they don't represent. They never claim to. So that's not a failure of multiculturalism. That's just another form of colonialism.
Yes, I agree. I mean, again, I'm not putting the onus on the communities. I think I'm putting it on those who implement these policies, who don't really want to very often engage with the internal diversity. You know, it's more convenient to have, you know,
but let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, because despite all the negatives, I will say this clearly, in Britain, we have had the best model. I've been around the world, right, and you take it for granted in some ways. Tough as it is now, it can get a lot worse. And it already has in parts of Europe who claim that they're enlightened. Yeah. And so for me, actually, the success of it was the multicultural approach, and we need to fight to protect that.
Have 2 minutes. Sorry.
I mean, I don't really know what to add after that. After your inputs, I think the only thing that I wanted to say, and essentially it's, I suppose, preaching to the choir, as they say, is that the ideology that Islam is incompatible with the Western values is a complete it's completely yes, But that's what's fed into us, and that's what's fed into why are we even having that conversation, right? Essentially, we know that Islam is a perfect religion, but Muslims are flawed, like any other human beings in this world. And essentially, like to be having the conversation from the aspect of like actually, if our Islam isn't compatible with the it's the wrong, I think, completely the wrong way to start the conversation. But in terms of like multiculturalism. And every single speaker said it. It depends on how you define, right? Like what you define as a society, what you define as your realities. I mean, in Birmingham, you'd probably say like this is a very multicultural city, but I can take you to different cities in the UK where you probably will struggle to find a single Muslim. So essentially, it triggers very much down to how you define it. I did I wanted to say something that was said earlier that frustrated me a little bit. Essentially, it's to do with the ideology, and I think we need to remember there are different experiences of Muslims, and many speakers did mention that. But the reality is that there are white Arabs who aren't racialized in the same way as black Arabs are. In fact, to the same extent that it was only a couple of years ago. When Syrians moved to the States, they were seen as the model citizens, and they were seen as the good citizens that were brought in. They were seen as they in fact identified as white rather than anything else. So actually, there is a racialized element to the work that we do. So I just wanted to bring that in. I genuinely think that's something that's left out in conversations, especially in these spaces where I've been to many ISOC events where we've spoken about racism within Islam. Because we those are the ugly truth that we often hide away from. So I just wanted to point that out.
If I might just briefly interject, just to clarify what
30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. I mean, we're not really. There's a confusion between experience and ideology. So when the West when certain Western governments have a problem with Muslim minorities, it's ostensibly because of the ideology which they don't trust. You know, so they say Islam, it's a religion. We view it as separate to ourselves, and anyone who's an adherent of that religion could basically be disloyal, or we don't trust them. But Muslims' experience differ because obviously it's those who look very clearly foreign or look not like the indigenous population obviously will be targeted more because they'll be noticed more. Their differences will be noticed more than someone who just basically, I don't know, looks, dresses, and acts completely like an indigenous person, such that you can't tell them apart, right? But that also requires Muslims then, even those, let's say, Syrian Arabs, to then act and also to compromise some, maybe possibly some of their outward manifestations of their religion in order to fit in. So the question, really, the issue of experience is like a secondary point, because the real battleground is the ideology, which the differences in the perspective of ideology rather than race. And I just want to kind of just also highlight that nationalism as one type of asabiyya is a problem. But there are other types of asabiyya, or groupism, let's just say, that are also problematic, or sectarianism is also problematic, such as race identity or even gender identity politics, which Muslims have adopted from the West, thinking, oh, this is the current discourse happening within the West, let's borrow it to get our own liberation. Why can't you just go from your own basis and perspective to get your own liberation, or just to be fairly treated at least, rather than saying, let's adopt these other foreign ideologies and their discussions where they've reduced the world to a fight between people of different hues or people of different genders, and now people with different gender expressions or gender identities. It gets cut, and of course the rich and the poor, and it gets cut into more and more pieces, when Islam is meant to end asabiyya, not reinforce it. And that's really my perspective. The only way to challenge it is to kind of not play the game in the first place and transcend asabiyya in all its forms.
That's human though, not Western.
But the reality is, like, what you said is true, but you can't tackle an issue if you don't identify the problem. And the problem is that there is a colonization is rooted in like nationalism is rooted in colonization, right? And essentially the proximity to whiteness is...
It's all the way around. Colonialism is rooted in nationalism, as one nation dominating other nations.
Essentially, what I'm trying to frame is that the proximity to whiteness is the issue, essentially.
It's incidental because Russians are white, but they're not viewed as Western.
Are treated differently for people of color experience different experiences, and therefore those are the realities and those are issues that exist within Islam not Islam essentially within the Muslim communities, is to then completely say that racism doesn't exist.
No. I'm saying it more specifically. Ethnic sectarianism exists within multiple ethnic groups, even if they might look the same or have similar hues. I mean, just look at, for example, Rwanda. Yeah, Hutus and Tutsis. They're not radically different in hue. Or I can just bring a more pertinent example of nationalism cutting people into two parts. Somalia and Somaliland. Same religion, same language. I went there, sorry. Same religion, same ethnicity, basically, same language. But because of an arbitrary idea of nationalism, they split into two different parts. And even within these territories, you have different tribes disliking other tribes, and so on and so forth. So all I'm saying is, asabiyya...
For example, we have Berbers who have been colonized by white Arabs.
Colonized by Arabs?
We can continue this after.
Berbers, well, okay.
But, so the next two questions are going to be combined, so the second and the third one.
Or at least come there.
I keep blocking I'm going to say shibboleths, that's one. Second and third question, so it's going to be, with regards to the idea of integration, what do you believe constitutes adequate enough integration before you embark upon assimilation instead? And then also, considering Muslim students are somewhat excluded from the university/Western lifestyle, does that mean Islamophobia or anti-Muslim rhetoric is inevitable? And, I think we'll start with the left this time. So...
Go first, please.
Okay. So it was the second and third question. So the second question is quite interesting. I genuinely don't have the answer for this, and I'll be very interested to hear what the panellists have to say, because essentially for myself, I do often find, like, I struggle with the battleground of, like, what is assimilation and what is integration. What do we relegate, so what do we actually support, what is good for our society. And I'm still very young, and I'm still trying to understand those experiences. And I'll give you an example of, like, how one thing I really struggle with. I don't know, recently, if you remember, there was a lot of Muslims this year, mashallah, that was given like OBEs and CBEs, and I was like, oh, incredible, amazing. But I don't think I'd ever accept one personally, and I had a battleground in terms of, like, it's rooted in nationalism, right? It's rooted in like the concept behind getting an OBE is actually a terrible thing. but it's also a big achievement, and where do you draw the line? And I think those are the kind of questions that I ask myself very often, that I debate with myself very often. And in terms of the second question, is Islamophobia inevitable? I think the sad reality is yes. In university, and I think there are different types of Islamophobia in university or in everyday practice. Because the reality is when you occupy a space that was never created for you, let's not remember, like, it was less than like 50, 60 years ago, where the university was filled with white men, right? And now there are like all kinds of people going to university, but then the way universities are run has never changed. They exist and look exactly the same. The curricula looks exactly the same. So those spaces don't exist for you. So essentially, the reality is that you probably face levels of Islamophobia, but I also think there is something like you said it earlier, like you feel sorry for our generation, but us actually we are a very resilient generation, and I think there are a lot of incredible things that, like, even this ISOC is doing to change that culture and to change those experiences. And one of them is like the Islamophobia Awareness Month, that a lot of ISOCs organise across the country to raise awareness of those experiences. Professor.
Right. Well, it's a tricky question about integration and assimilation, because both are, very much politicized terms. So when, policymakers talk about integration of Muslims or other minorities, they mean actually assimilation. Within the communities, maybe any effort to integrate is immediately branded as assimilation. So, I don't think, it's possible for me to give a kind of normative statement of, what level of integration is acceptable. I think it's just, we need to be pragmatic and see that, when Muslims are politically active, when they contribute to societies, they're integrated within these societies. It doesn't matter whether they are loyal to this society. It doesn't matter which element of their identity is more important. Are they more British or Muslim? If they are contributing, work in the society, they're integrated. They're part of the society. And I suppose it depends really on the individual to decide how far to go in this kind of integration assimilation balance. Yes, is Islamophobia inevitable? Yes, obviously it has a long history. Islamophobia, although being a very recent term, is part and parcel of European history. Again, we talked a lot about the kind of the racist foundations of nationalism. European identity. One of the core elements defining Europe and setting Europe apart from other cultural civilizations is what we would call today Islamophobia, to demarcate Europe as Christendom from Islam. So it has historic roots. On the other hand, there's always a counter discourse. There are always people challenge this, and again, I agree completely with Salma that Britain, again, no reason to be complacent, has done a better job. There's a very strong Muslim civil society. It's not that easy to get away with saying Islamophobic things in the public arena than in other European countries, where the president of a country makes blatant Islamophobic statements and is not challenged at all. So it is going to be part of our societies, but I think again there are many forces challenging that at the same time.
So I'm going to keep it slightly brief so we can just move on.
The short answer is, if you are being otherized, no amount of integration or even assimilation will save you. Just ask the Bosnians. 500 years, European Muslims. You guys have grown up here, but I don't know if you're aware that we have a European Muslim country. Yeah. So all these things about can it be Western and Muslim, it's ridiculous. There's a reality there. Not like some of us who, are descendants of immigrants to this country. Spain. There was centuries of Spanish Islam. So being European, being Western and Muslim, there is no contradiction. But when, like I said, you're being otherized, so Bosnians, there was a genocide that happened, and that's when I was at uni, that time 1990s, and it's finally been acknowledged as a genocide. And those Muslims actually didn't look like, if you're going to get stereotypical, the women didn't wear hijab, the blonde wearing miniskirts, the guys, were not wearing beards. They had Muslim names, and that was enough, because when things turned politically. And when you look at the Jewish community was the most assimilated minority in Europe. When it comes to science, when it comes to music, when it comes to culture, when it comes to film. In Germany, in political circles, the Jewish community were totally assimilated. But when the political leadership decided they were going to use them as scapegoats, that it wasn't enough for them to have fitted in. So if you think you're going to escape by looking like you're going to fit in, I'm sorry, the answer is that's not going to happen. The answer is making sure that society as a whole remains pluralistic and anti-racist.
Okay, so is Islamophobia inevitable? I wish it, obviously it doesn't have to be if people just make the decision not to repeat history, but I do agree that Christendom was very much defined by well, contrary to the kind of the Western, the Islamic East, and Islamic West, of course, Spain and Portugal at the time, Iberia, which was where Muslims were ruling. But what I'll say is that if Islamophobia is inevitable, it's because of distrust of minorities, which has recurred throughout history. And I don't see under the nation-state model how you can avoid that. Distrust of minority groups or what have you. Even when you have states that have multiple nations, there's problems. Not always in the worst possible way, but like Canada, tensions between French speakers, English speakers. Holland, tensions between Dutch speakers and French speakers, and so on and so forth, right? So that's just one of those things. And in Africa and South America, and South America not so much, but Africa and other such countries, in Asia, different nations being in the same country actually can spark wars where people are fighting to say who determines the national character of that country. For example, in India is one example, where people who are the same ethnicity, but just because of different religions, which are linked then to a nation, idea of a nation, then causes sectarianism and so on. So that does that. As for the question of, I want to go back to the integration assimilation. Is Islam compatible into Western values, which was an earlier question? Why does it have to be? Why can't you just have a religion? It doesn't have to necessarily be compliant with secular liberalism, but why does it have to be? As long as you're basically not breaking the laws, then so what if you have a belief system? Otherwise, what you're saying is, we only tolerate you if you're basically not different to us in any way. That's not toleration, is it? Right? But why does it have to be? No one ever asked that question. People say, oh, no, of course it's not incompatible, or whatever. Like, well, even if it is, or even if it's incompatible with the dominant ideology, secular liberalism, so what? Why is that a problem? Right? Muslims aren't going to take over the West anytime soon to change it, so why not just let us be a minority that has our own religion, our own worldview, like others?
Why not?
And what I also say is that I do agree with Sister Salma's point about, Jews were very assimilated into Europe. They were pointed to by the far right or others to say, look, they're not assimilated. They look different, even though they're actually a very small minority. But they would find them out, make a video documentary. I'm talking about the Nazis here, not about the EDL going through Whitechapel, even though there's parallels. But the Nazis made a video documentary going through Jewish areas where Jews were wearing kind of like religious clothing or what have you, say, oh, look at these, they're not assimilated to our way of life and what have you. And then when you brought up Jews who were assimilated in clothing, looked exactly the same in clothing and everything like this, and even lifestyle even, they'd say, oh, they're just going undercover and subverting our society from within without being noticed. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. What I also say is that if you also kind of comply with some of the government's wishes to change certain religious perspectives or not adopt certain religious perspectives that they deem to be political, for example, you're also conceding the ground to the government, and they can make more demands of you. I've never heard of anyone get rid of a bully by agreeing with everything the bully asks of them. And if they're being bullied, saying, you're not to believe in certain concepts of government or certain that's part of your religion, this is extreme, I've never heard that being kind of dealt with by the person just agreeing with what the government saying, fine, you know what, I'll let that go, and then they'll make more demands. Okay, the next thing is going to be male circumcision. The next one's going to be, and so on and so forth. Yeah, anyway, so I'm just saying is that assimilation has never been a cure or solution for anything.
The final question, if you could just answer in like 1 minute, and then we're going to give it to the floor and then hopefully wrap up. Excuse the wording of this. Do you possess an optimistic attitude towards the future for Muslims in Britain, especially with the election of allies of Muslims, with allies of Muslims reaching positions of power, such as the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party, or do you feel nothing has changed? Abdullah, would you like to go first? I'm going to have him singing over Jeremy Corbyn by the show.
Well, I mean, I suppose just putting Jeremy Corbyn to one side at the moment.
He doesn't want you to. He wants you to address it.
Let's not forget that the government that implemented or came up with Prevent was the Labour Party under Tony Blair.
New Labour.
Okay, yeah, all right. And the Conservative government has basically continued the Labour policy in this regard. What I will say is that the Oxford English Dictionary defines Islamophobia as being, as obviously a fear or hatred against Islam, especially the political aspects of it, which I was quite amazed that the Oxford English Dictionary includes that. And then when you see the Conservative government and its predecessors, from Tony Blair's time, let's just say, who argued that the enemy is a belief about Islam that has political aspects in it, Islamism or what have you, and they tout that out. But they say, oh no, but that's not nothing to do with Islam. That's separate from Islam. Obviously, we can define Islam for you. So yeah, that's separate from Islam. And Islam is just a peaceful, almost pacifist religion that's only manifests itself in private areas. Then when the average British person who's told to hate or to blame for the causes of violence the political aspects of Islam, and they're told that's not part of Islam, and when they do reading or Islamophobes point it out to them that those political aspects of Islam that the government has told you to hate is actually part of Islam, then the government is creating a conveyor belt to Islamophobia. Because what do the Islamophobes always say? They say that how comes no one's talking about the political aspects that are part and parcel of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings in life? The government is in denial. Now, of course, the government can't be openly talking about that because I know because it has allies, client regimes in the Muslim world that it doesn't want to offend or at least create trouble for them amongst their populations. But what I will say is that, am I optimistic? I don't know. I haven't seen anything in history to show that things have gone another way, unless you change the equation, being that, let's say, something happens in the Muslim world where Muslims get a united politically that then become the dominant strategic force. Then the West will say, you know what? Let's accept this regime and not have a trouble with Muslims like the Ottomans. You know, they didn't have trouble with Ottomans so much towards the latter period, and they didn't have a go at Muslims who were pro-Ottoman.
That's why they broke up the empire. Of course, they had a problem with the Ottoman Empire.
Not exactly. They wanted to preserve it so they could keep a puppet regime to govern their colonial interests.
No, they got Saudis.
Until Mustafa Kemal changed, but that's a different discussion. But my point is, yeah. Anyway, so anyway, what I'm going to say is that unless we can change the equation geopolitically, I don't know how things can change by in of themselves.
Yes, briefly, please.
I'm going to do this briefly, but I will try. I'm optimistic, but there's a big fight on, guys. And it's going to go either way, depending on what you do and what you don't do. So, and forgive me if I'm going to take some liberty here, because we've got a sitting audience here of people who are going to make that happen or not happen. It's critical time now, more than any other that I can think of in the last since my lifetime anyway. Because for the first time, not just in one generation, for the first time in more than a century in British politics, we have an opposition on the verge of actually taking power, which would have a genuine ethical foreign policy, which is unapologetically standing by Muslims, which doesn't hide away from addressing the issue of the Palestinians. And because of that, and because of the commitment to financial equality in this country, is being absolutely vilified. This attack on Jeremy Corbyn is purely not because of him as a person, is because he has stood for Palestinians and because he's standing against vested financial interests. And if you guys don't stand by him, and there's no reason why we can't win, because actually we've got the numbers. If you look at places like Birmingham, if you look up and down the country, it will be our fault if we don't turn out and join in that fight. There's no such thing as neutral now. If you stay out of it, as far as I'm concerned, you've helped the opposition. And people like Jeremy are literally risking their lives. When he was attacked in Finsbury Park Mosque, they're talking about it being an egging. He was punched in the head. Last year, the guy with the van was trying to kill him. Right? You're not going to hear about that in the mainstream media. He is making so many sacrifices. So many other people are. And I'm not saying this as I'm not even a Labour Party member. I was the first person out there, going on about New Labour. That's why I'm not allowed. I've not been a member because I'll fight on the issues. But what I can say is there's a historic opportunity, not just to protest, but actually take power in the United Kingdom. Diminished as it may well be after Brexit, is still a very, very powerful player in the world. And I see that as a huge opportunity. And please do not waste it. Get registered, make sure your vote counts, and get active, because whether he's elected or not, there's going to be a counter-revolution. We know the mainstream media, those with power, those who are certain lobbyists, will do their very best to undermine. And it's going to take people like you and me to make sure what's good for this country, not just what's good for Muslims, what's good for this country. And I believe that is Jeremy Corbyn.
Anyone wants to sign up, come to me after the event. Professor.
Right, I'm not going to say anything about Jeremy Corbyn either. I suppose, yeah, we have to be optimistic. I mean, there was a lot of references to Jews and Catholics and sort of the suspicion of minorities, as sort of historic cases. But I mean, if you look at, these two cases, there has been a complete U-turn. I mean, nobody in Britain is questioning the loyalty of Catholics.
Now,
I mean, nobody, I mean, again, when it comes to attitudes towards Jews, the sort of the internal other European societies, I mean, there has been a complete U-turn after the Holocaust. So these attitudes can change, they're not there enshrined. I think what we have to learn is that, and again, I had to learn it myself, given sort of Brexit and Trump and all the rest of it, that we shouldn't be complacent. I'm sort of a liberal guy. I thought we all settled on liberal values, pluralism, minority rights, but we can't take these things for granted. And of course, political activism is one way of challenging these discourses. I suppose there are also other ways of becoming active in society.
Thank you. That was really brief. Thank you.
You look surprised. How can I survey this very briefly? Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't be in this country if I didn't have hope. I'd be jumping on the plane, to see what's going on over there. So yeah, I'm 100% filled with hope, and I 100% agree with what Salman said. I think this is the fight of our generation, like I said earlier, and we are at the forefront of it. It will affect us, and this is the first time in a very long time that there is a leader of the Labour Party that has the best interests of Muslims in place, and there are a lot can be said about allies, but genuinely Jeremy Corbyn is the only person that I would rally behind and get anybody else to rally behind. So yeah, 100%.
Thank you. Very much what she'd say, but now it's questions from the audience. So okay, that's good. If you guys need a microphone, let me know. But if you could project your voice, that would be fine as well. So
if they could ask specific people, then we'd be fine.
Oh yeah, and just let us know who the question's subjected to. So Abdullah.
This is for the professor. You mentioned about the Muslims in Britain being of a low class and low income. Do you think there's been a decline of academia in the Muslim world compared to, say, the Islamic Golden Age? Do you think the standards are declining?
In Britain or?
In Britain, yeah, because of the low income families.
Well, I don't really know the numbers and so on, but I think there is an issue about social mobility, access to higher education, among Muslim communities in particular, again, which does not affect only Muslim communities, it affects other minority communities. I think it's just, it's sort of the austerity world we're living in, where social exclusion has increased, and that obviously has affected communities that have been traditionally more socioeconomically marginalized. So I think it's more challenging. But I think, again, it's not a Muslim issue per se as such. It affects former white working class members of British society. There's a general issue of social exclusion and social disparity, that obviously affects, in particular, communities that have been historically socioeconomically marginalized.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Can I just add something? I was going to say there are actually stats to prove even though I agree with you, that Muslims have actually outperformed their counterparts regardless, even of the economic situation. In
Birmingham, the kids who are attaining the least well academically are white working class boys. That's one of the issues I raised when I was a counsellor. So it is a class issue, and it just so happens that a large number of Muslims in this country have to belong to the kind of lower socio-economic class, working class, and so some of the figures are reflected in that. But it's not just a Muslim issue.
Okay, Aisha.
So if anyone wants to specifically ask this question, you can. If not, direct at someone. But just following on from the conversation, would you agree that it's dangerous to reduce being Muslim to just an aspect of our identity? Do you think that this makes Islam susceptible to dilution, politicization, and influenced by other isms today?
Can I ask for clarification? When you say dilute, do you mean like you're physically looking Muslim, or like what do you mean by that?
By dilute, as in like in Britain, we're kind of seeing these new versions of Islam where it's just about like
liberalised and what have you, right? Yeah.
I don't want to say that word, but yeah, but like
I'll say
it. But like sometimes now, it's almost as if being Muslim is just a political identity rather than
cool hashtag.
Like being Muslim as in your religion or submitting to God.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone wants that.
It's up to anyone.
Interesting.
Happy to.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Can I give a brief that you can? Because I was just going to say there is no way you can dilute Islam. Like you can't actually dilute like your Islam, right? But if you mean from the perspective of like the way like you're viewed like as a Muslim individual, then there are certain things like that. Like I am very conscious about the way I come across to certain individuals because I am a Muslim woman, or the way I enact in certain situations. I'm very conscious about the way I act, and I think it's difficult to answer that question because it's a very, very subjective answer, right? Like everybody has a different experience and everybody has a different understanding of what of what Islam means to them. But to me, what I would say is that like you couldn't like the 5 pillars of Islam are the 5 pillars of Islam. You couldn't dilute that.
What?
Sorry, what?
Oh, sorry. No, say.
Yeah. Because I think I might have misunderstood you, maybe.
I think maybe I'm getting the gist of what she's saying, and it's not a subjective experience. Okay, that's all right.
You sure?
I don't.
It's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with debate. I love a good debate.
I don't subscribe to the postmodernism, almost Nietzschean idea that truth is subjective. I think truth is beyond human beings, objective, and we try to understand it. Islam is submission to God, and of course its core tenets, which are based on written texts, which can't be changed and won't change. So if someone says, I'm a Muslim, but I don't believe in God, but I'm a Muslim, and my being a Muslim is predicated on me just identifying as such, we say, well, no, being a Muslim is a description, not an identity, right? If you meet the description of, at least submit with your mouth anyway, so I submit to God and to the Creator, then that defines you as a Muslim, right? If you start contradicting core tenets which multiple interpretations are impossible of, are not impossible not possible to have rather, then that takes you outside the fold of Islam. So it's a descriptor. So what you mean? I think what this means by dilution is someone says, "Well, I'm a Muslim. I drink alcohol." I say, "Oh, so that doesn't prove that alcohol is halal now just because you're a Muslim and you can do it." So what do you have to say against terrorists who say they commit terrorism and they're Muslim? Right? What is your response to them? Oh, because then the takfir comes out, right? Oh, no, but that's not true Muslim. Well, if you believe Islam represents something, you can then say, well, Islam prohibits targeting civilians based on the text, and there's no multiple interpretations of this, and so anyone who does so is acting outside Islam. And anyone who justifies it is is believing outside Islam. They're going outside Islam now. Now I have a basis to say that. But if Islam is based purely on what anyone feels like doing or feels is personally okay to them, and they label themselves Muslim, well then you're diluting. Well then Islam doesn't mean anything at all whatsoever. It just becomes a label. And I fear that maybe in many decades' time, all that will remain for Muslim communities that we all just unite on the Palestine issue, and that's it. Right? But everything else, does God exist, all this stuff, variations. Right? Variation. That's what's going to happen. And just look at our predecessors. I was speaking to there was an Orthodox Jew and I was talking to, and I was just discussing him the whole issue of can you be British Muslim, all this kind of stuff. And he's saying, oh, that's really fascinating because we had the same discussion 30 years ago amongst our community. I'm like, what? And he was telling me that then from that, obviously, there were Jews who became liberal and they disowned their religion and or even create a sub-branch called liberal reform Judaism, which really just rejects a lot of the Jewish texts to be liberal and reform. And because they call themselves Jewish now, you know, they have to be accepted by such, even though Orthodox Judaism doesn't recognize that as being consistent. But because they can still label themselves as such, this is a religious interpretation, and we continue to identify themselves as such, it gets viewed as being accepted as part of the discourse. So all I'm saying is that we should learn from our predecessors, very much so, who kind of were here in this country, and I've learned from them directly as they've been telling me this kind of discussions. Therefore, Islam means something. It represents something, not your personal experience. Hell no. If it represents the personal experience of Muslims, then it will be something completely different, right? Islam represents the divine communication of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying that we shouldn't bring up the word experience at all, and it's irrelevant. People's personal experience. Of course, what the text.
What the text says, and what is
agreed. Sorry. Because we're talking about Islam. We're not talking about Muslim experience, and they're different things.
No, you have to. Again, for us being insan, we are the bridge of two worlds, the unseen and the seen. So there's always like this tension, which could be a contradiction, but for me, it's a reconciling. Right? So we are eternal beings in a finite body. We are living in certain geography and certain points in time, but Islam is a universal message for all mankind, for all time. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't get interpreted and reinterpreted. So I don't know I'm not sure whether I agree or disagree if I've understood what you're saying correctly. Because we have something called ijtihad. Yeah. Right from the beginning of the revelations, there were differences in interpretation. And Islam accepts that. The danger is...
But not in all areas. And it's not subject to experience. It's subject to interpreting a text. The text is not based on different experience. I had a different experience of sort of Fatiha to you. It's like, no, it has a meaning to it.
But that was also never said.
If I can... I don't know, you're doing a false straw man. Nobody said that. I don't know what you're arguing against there. Right. So, for example...
Just saying experience is not really relevant.
Was revealed over 23 years. It wasn't just this book that just came down, right? And actually, it was revealed for context of the Muslims at that time. So, for example, when the lady went up to... Umar and then had to said about the mahar, things were made clear. Drinking, it was halal, but at the beginning, just don't drink while you're praying, don't be drunk. And then the verse came, no, it's haram. When they were questioned about daughters and the equality of daughters, it was in response to specific things that happened. So we can never ever, and this is the complexity of our beautiful faith. We have to wrestle with it. There are some beautiful, easy, straightforward things. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. That, the shahada, that is either you're a Muslim or not. Apart from that, we also say the Quran is divinely revealed. But what I will not accept is only one version of that, what that means, because then you're in dangerous territory. And we have to constantly engage with it and apply it to our specific context as to how can we live faithfully, sincerely, spiritually to that message, but given the context that we live in. That's why it's no accident that in Pakistan you'll have a certain version, in Malaysia you'll have a certain version, in Bosnia you'll have a certain version, in America. And that's not a bad thing, because Islam actually embraces plurality and diversity, and that's why it's its strength. And despite all Islamophobia, it's still the fastest growing religion in the West. It's not going anywhere.
Islam doesn't differ depending on geographical location.
It differs in its manifestation, not in the belief.
One could argue there's no contradictory self-contradictory commands in the Quran, and also that when the alcohol wasn't made initially prohibited, that was because Islam hadn't been delivered by that point in time. So let's just say every time a religion is being delivered for the first time, not everything is instantly prohibited. Maybe we can accept that as a general rule. But now Islam is complete, and that's never going to be a point in time that Islam has to be reintroduced to mankind, because it already has been introduced. Therefore, the universal hukum or judgment remains constant, which is alcohol is prohibited, full stop, the end.
What about the slaves, right? And the right hand that you possess? Does it mean now we're going to go around Birmingham saying, all right, we're going to have slaves?
There's a difference between making slaves and managing pre-existing slaves. So the Quran doesn't say make new slaves. It just has a management system. So if it encounters that phenomenon again, it has a way to manage it, to create justice and mercy and so on and so forth. But it doesn't say go out and create new slaves.
No, the point, it doesn't forbid it either. So you're not. So the point is, even now, what you're doing,
it doesn't say to create new slaves.
And I think that's fine. But don't deny that other people. I'm not interpreting anything.
It doesn't say. Bring me an interpretation where people say create new slaves. It doesn't. There's no command in the Quran to create new slaves.
There's no command which says drive cars, but it doesn't mean that we.
Based on ijtihad on the
That's a very HT argument. If it's not commanded in the Quran, it's
no, it's not. It's an Islamic Orthodox argument. What's that got to do with HT?
And it's okay to have different opinions. It's okay. We're all still Muslim.
Everyone could just quiet down, please.
Just to kind of change the topic slightly, I agree with that you can't dilute Islam. You can dilute Muslims, right? There's a difference. For example, we've seen Muslims coming out when it comes to the LGBT as Muslim. You have this kind of reformed Islam, this modern Islam. In fact, you've got even Muslims who are kind of calling to vote for a political party who has the blood of 1.5 million Muslims on their hand, at the expense of trying to find weapons of mass destruction which we never found. However, that's another argument. Now, what?
Sorry?
My question is for
the last bit.
Tony Blair. Get it.
My question is for Abdullah. What is the government's role in secularizing and assimilating the Muslim community into a path of so-called British Islam, which is what the whole kind of event's about, whatever that means, this kind of British Islam, the secularization, assimilation of the Muslim community. What is the government's role in this? Because a lot of the time we've been talking about the far right and racism, and it just kind of, pops into existence, whereas this is an institution-led assimilation, secularization. What's your thoughts on that, brother?
Okay, so what's the government's role in basically secularizing?
You're going to have like 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Okay, the government will...
Come on, the question was longer than that, man.
2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Okay.
That was my favourite ice.
All right. So the government uses all organs of government to implement its policies. So it will use Ofsted against schools which are teaching certain religious curricula which it doesn't approve of. It will say, and it will use the term extremism. It will use a charity commission against certain charities which it deems to be promoting or allowing speakers who are quote-unquote extremists, and then it will start getting involved and putting disproportionate, I'd argue, from my perception of this, disproportionate, what some people have also argued, disproportionate attention on Muslim charities compared to non-Muslim charities, and so on. So it will use the organs of state to implement policies. So it won't necessarily go around like creating an inquisition court and just tell people, what do you believe, and if not, I'm going to start torturing you. It's not doing that. Okay, although obviously in history in Europe that was done by the Spanish, of course. But what it will do is it will first try pressure kind of tactics. So many ISOCs, many Islamic societies or MSAs for any international students here, Muslim student societies, they will naturally just feel pressured to not invite certain speakers, to not discuss controversial topics, thinking, let's just keep it, does God exist? Yeah, that's enough, right? Or like, wasn't the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ really merciful and kind to his neighbor and others? Like, that's great, but is that all what he talked about? Is that all what he commanded? Because if you don't express the full panoply of what Islam is, then you're basically advocating a deficient and partial religion, but religion with bits missing in it. It's not the complete solution. So Islam has no redress for inequality in economics, because you don't want to discuss that because it's part of politics. How will it end world poverty? I can't talk about that. That's going to create problems of fitna. Well, I'm pretty sure world poverty is a bigger fitna, a bigger problem, a bigger concern. So basically, that's the government right at the moment. It's reticent to do it by force at the moment because, for many reasons, the political climate is not sufficient, it's not ready, and many people are worried that it'll be affecting them, like many atheists and Christian Islamophobes were worried that just, they'd be done for hate and what have you, right? So they don't want to back the government on its policies. So, but the thing is this, if you don't take a stand and say, no, this is our belief, it's not extreme, it's mainstream, it always has been for 1400 years, like belief in the caliphate, it's not HT or anything, it's mainstream. Every school of thought, every scholar in Islam, with the exception of a Khawarij branch and one Mu'tazilite, didn't believe in the caliphate. Everyone else said it was obligatory. And that one Khawarij guy, the one Mu'tazilite guy, Al-Assam, as he was called, he only said, if you can get by with an anarchy, it's fine. If not, then caliphate is obligatory, right? Yeah. So anyway, so my point is this: unless you make a stand and proudly say these are our beliefs, and we're going to keep doing what we're doing, no matter what you say, if you don't do that, then they're going to keep incrementally taking more space away until the next generation, and generation after you, and generation after that will be even more silent, even more cowardly, even more scared than yourself, and Islam will be reduced purely to, salvation is, you can believe in God if you want to, if you're not, you're still saved, it's fine. And that's it. That's what it's going to be reduced down to. And everything's permitted. That's what it will be reduced down to.
Move on to 1 second. I want to try something with the light. I'm going to go to this side because, and sisters, if you've got any questions, please do put your hands up because it's predominantly male, so quality and all that.
What was that? I saw that.
Would you like the mic?
I think it should be fine.
I believe in it.
What do you make of people joining groups like ISIS having their Britishness revoked?
Is that to a specific speaker?
Salma?
Again, it's just symptomatic of the Islamophobic environment. What Sajid Javed has done is actually illegal. He's not allowed to, and I'm very confident that as it goes through the courts, it will be established as such. This is about him and trying to get Tory leadership, and a way to do that is to look like a tough on Muslims. I don't know if you heard of Jihadi John. He's wanting to come back. No one's talking about taking away his citizenship. So it's very obvious.
Is he dead? Is he not dead?
No?
Jack.
Sorry, Jack.
Jack.
Sorry, it's all the same. No. And his parents are, having these sympathetic interviews and all the rest of it. So that's a game of politics at the moment. And I think a lot of people understand, even the ones, and of course it doesn't mean you agree with what she did and all the rest of it, but the point of principle about having your citizenship stripped in that way doesn't just make Muslims a target, it makes anybody whose parents came from somewhere else a target. So I don't see this actually going anywhere, if that's any consolation. But the fact that he uses it in this really cynical way tells you, really where we're at politically.
I mean, the precedent that sets is actually terrifying.
I see more hands every time we move
I hope
on.
that answers your question.
I'll just pass you the mic. Would you like the mic or?
It's okay. Professor, you said earlier after the Holocaust there was a U-turn with the Jewish people. Will you take another Holocaust or similar event to make a U-turn on the Muslim view?
Yes, I wasn't necessarily implying that, but I suppose what this historical lesson tells us, that it had to get to this stage for European societies to reconsider the way how they've treated Jews historically. I don't think we need to be worried about another Holocaust. I think there are other issues such as this particular we need to be worried about. But I think we are probably getting to more lows in the near future in terms of, the mainstreaming of Islamophobia, people trying to win, political points, to score politically by making statements in the public. So the pressure on communities will increase. Again, we won't have another Holocaust, but certainly it will become, much more polarized and contested.
Yes, just quickly add to that. With Catholicism, them being accepted by Protestant countries was only when the Pope had lost the kind of power that he used to have, and then Catholics were deemed to be no longer a political threat. Certainly when in secular countries or secularized context, then it's like, all right, Catholics are no longer a political threat as they used to be to Protestants, and so we'll tolerate them now. So it was when international politics changed that then Catholics were accepted. As for Jews, I don't think the Holocaust was the be-all and end-all of that U-turn, because anti-Semitism still was retained by many European governments. I mean, Franklin D. Roosevelt, I believe, knew about the death camps in Germany and actually tried to, there's evidence to show that he spoke to newspapers, or at least influenced newspapers to play down those stories during World War II. And again, no one ever fought World War II for Jews, right? But afterwards, it's like, oh yeah, we did it for moral reasons, rather than just maintaining the balance of power in Europe. So anti-Semitism is still a problem, and was still a problem even initially after the Holocaust, due to the residual anti-Semitism and hatred and xenophobia against minorities that were retained in, unfortunately, the many Western circles of power.
Okay.
I would argue that there is a genocide of Muslims happening right now.
Yeah.
Around the world. So, like, essentially, like, do we need another when it's actually happening there, like right now?
Burma, China, even in India. Huge scale.
Okay. Let's just put a hand up. Yo, you. Would you like the mic?
No, it's okay. So, I'm not from here. I'm from Canada. So this is like weird for me to hear British talk. But everything we've been discussing today with you guys are like, with your British and Islam and everything, I feel like with the Western world and Islam, for us to fight against or like protect ourselves or like be a part of it, we have to be united as Muslims from different countries, from like Canadians, British, ones back home, like me, Somalia, everywhere. So when Brother Abdullah said that our experiences in Islam are like, I understand they should be like, our experiences shouldn't define Islam. Like, if I had a bad time wearing the hijab, I shouldn't be like, we shouldn't wear the hijab anymore. But at the same time, our experiences do define us as Muslims, and what we experience affect us. So before we can protect ourselves or like understand what's going on in the West, we have to understand what's going on in the Muslim community and how we treat each other differently with our skin color, where we're from, and everything. So for you to say that experiences should have no part in Islam, I don't understand what you mean.
Okay.
There's a lot. It has. Yeah, I understand that the Prophet and Allah spoke against it, but it still exists. Like, we treat each other differently.
Okay.
1 minute.
Okay. So just to clarify, I said that people's personal experiences, their likes, their personal likes and dislikes, their tastes, should have no bearing on the best attempt to objectively interpret the text that we can. And on many areas we agree. Like, everyone believes Asabiyya is wrong. Everyone believes that believing an Arab is superior to a non-Arab is wrong, because the Prophet Muhammad explicitly says so, not different interpretations. In fact, I'd actually argue the case is the opposite, unfortunately. There are some people who say they don't like Muslims of different ethnic groups or backgrounds, or they don't want to give their daughter in marriage to someone of a different ethnic background, and they try to bring pseudo-Islamic arguments to justify their tastes. And we call them out, all of us should be calling them out, saying, no, what you're talking about is Jahiliyyah, is outside the fold of Islam in your conduct, and don't try to then twist Islam to justify your personal taste. So I'd even argue that connecting personal tastes to Islam is the cause of the problem. Not, well, we need to recognize the solution. No, it's the cause of it in the first place. So I don't care if someone does find a prospective suitor for their daughter to be from a background culture that they don't like or they find alien to themselves. If the person's on good deen, that's all that matters. And they could look after their child and obviously their daughter and so on and so forth, and meet all the Islamic criteria. That's all that should matter. And that's what I'm basically been saying.
Okay, thank you. So whoever's got their hands up now, 1, 2, 3, 4, you're going to be the final questions. So can you put your hands up again? So I can 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we'll just start with you, Mitchell.
Can you just get everyone to do the questions and then we'll write them down?
Are you guys fine with that? So you all just ask your questions now and then they'll answer them.
I mean, my question is not specific to any of the speakers, but I think what I found from the debate, one thing that was missing was the the point that when it comes to this discussion of identity and being British or being Muslim, it's not really a debate that we as a Muslim community ourselves have instigated. So when I look at, let's say, my parents, I don't ever, recall there being a debate or a discussion on whether they are British or whether they are Muslim and where they belong and so on and so forth. And I think that's important because it kind of almost reinforces Abdullah's point that, there is almost an agenda in terms of why the discussion has come to the fore. So just from the top of my mind, I remember it was Tony Blair who spoke about how those people who don't oppose, for example, the idea of Ummah, or those who oppose the idea of homosexuality, they are deemed as extremists. So isn't it really the case that the government will only consider you to be British if you almost follow a type of Islam that is kind of compatible, that is kind of almost, appeasing to them? And it seems now that the threat is almost quite real, that if you don't conform, then, we will label you as an extremist, or worse still, we will revoke your Britishness. It's quite ludicrous that we here are debating that we are British, yet just by the click of a button, they can revoke your Britishness any moment that they want. So I think it's important to kind of maybe understand this, that this isn't a debate that we as Muslims have brought to the fore. In fact, the government has brought it to the fore because they want you to follow a certain type of Islam. And I think that's important to kind of recognise.
Is that specific to any panelists?
That was more of a statement than a question, if anything. That was a statement. And you're 100% right.
We all agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Question for yeah, that's all right. I don't need it. Questions for maybe anyone can answer. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the talk. And my question is, what would you comment on the ayah لن ترضى عنك اليهود والنصارى حتى تتبع ملتهم, which means the Jews and the Christians will not be happy with you until you follow them? That was just a comment from you, just to maybe get that insight from my view.
Project.
Do you not think that there is a genuine concern for British non-Muslims about the political, the certain Muslim groups that have a political motive and they aim to achieve an Islamic state in this country? And if so, what should we do about that?
Is that specific to a certain panelist, or?
That'd be interesting.
Okay. You guys are lucky you got so many questions to answer. And the final one from the brother at the back.
I have two questions.
It's kind of cheating, It's kind of cheating.
Why?
It's fine.
Am I not the last one?
Yeah, you'll be the last. Unless the gentleman behind you had a question. That's fine. You can take his question.
So, this is a question for anyone who wants to answer. Should we vote for Labour and left-wing parties when we have to compromise parts of our religion, such as unconditional recognition of homosexuality and the indoctrination of our children in primary school? That's the first part. The second part is to Salman. Did you say Muslims are a minority and gays are a minority, so should we unite?
Muslims are a minority and?
And gays are minority, so should we unite?
Did I say that, or are you asking me, should we?
Did you say that?
What I would say is that any oppressed community should not be pitted against each other. And where we understand about people are persecuted, are vulnerable, then we stand by them. We can only live in peace in this country. This is not an Islamic country, just to remind you guys. We're living in a non-Muslim country. And the framework, because we kind of think this is a God-given thing, these are human kind of created institutions as to the basis which citizens belong or don't belong. And what we have, and it took me a while to get there, so just bear with me, because it's easy to just have our bubble and say, well, it's this or that. The only reason we can claim our safety, our rights to pray, our right to halal food, our right to wear hijab, our right to get married, with our Islamic institutions, our right to have mosques, is called pluralism. And that is on the basis that a majority who are not Muslim, who maybe don't even believe in God, who may actually, deep down, even feel some hostility and revulsion for what we believe, because they really think we're daft or stupid or misguided, right? But we're relying not just on their tolerance, but their respect for us to live our lifestyle, as long as we don't harm them, right? We're not living here with these rights because they're promoting us. They're not promoting us, are they? Are they saying Islam is great? By allowing us to live our lives. Is anybody from the Muslim community accusing them of promoting our religion? But our religion is protected. If you're attacked, whether the police do something or not, but the fact is, the law is, if you're attacked because of your Muslim action, belief, you are supposed to be protected. Is that right or not?
Supposed to be, yeah.
So if we want our rights, and we want non-Muslims to defend our rights, we would be the biggest hypocrites if we were not able to say unapologetically that I may not agree with this person, whether it's a Christian or a Jew or a secular person or a person from the LGBT community. If they're being persecuted, if they're being harmed, if we were not to say, we don't have to agree with you, we can even disagree quite clearly about the things that you do or believe in, but I will defend your right to live your lifestyle choices as long as you don't impose them on me or cause harm to other people. That, for me, is a fundamental principle. So no, I make no apologies of standing side by side with those people who are persecuted from whatever background. Because we ourselves rely, the fact that we are here in this country, a minority whose, like I said, our faith is not, not only not shared, but actually probably disliked by a lot of people. But that's the basis of our safety. So how can we demand that for ourselves and not protect it for other people?
Brother Abdullah, the first question I asked, can you answer if you can?
Okay. The first question, which is, okay, we're voting for the Labour Party, or was that?
Should we vote for Labour and left-wing parties?
Okay, I'll just connect it up to your last question, I think. There's a difference between demanding consistency from people who are not Muslims and approval.
Yeah.
So the Quran says, do not dispute with the people of the book unless you witness them committing injustice. Now, you can't say to people of the book, don't do this because the Quran says so, because they won't accept that basis. So it basically means that if you see them acting one way to someone and one way to someone else, who is, even though they deserve the same treatment, so they're being inconsistent with the values. And what you've always seen me in public domains and debates on the big questions and so on, is I've only ever asked for consistency. So, either you basically, with the whole Me Too thing and basically courtship, saying, so if courtship is, either you allow courtship or anyone to initiate courtship, short of physical attack, for example, or you ban the genders from intermixing, but don't have this halfway point where allow it, but if someone doesn't like someone's approach and another person didn't know because they're not psychic, you can prosecute them. This is like a halfway where it's confusing and contradicting. So I said, look, either allow it completely or ban it completely. No halfway house. And the same thing with our last debate on gambling as well, which both on that show. You can have a look at it. So when it comes to the issue of LGBT or what have you, here's the mistake people make, and this is just from my perspective here. I know that other panelists might disagree with me. You can say, look, do what you want in your life as long as you don't physically coerce anybody or you demand that people must be taught your perspective against their will or what have you, right? We can agree. You can just call that rights. But when we say, oh no, but we have to call this LGBT rights. Say, well, wait a second, what's LGBT rights distinct from other people's rights? You could just say human rights, or just rights, full stop. Why? Oh no, but you have to use the label LGBT. We have to stand with rainbow flags and what have you. Say no, just be basically saying, look everyone, don't basically beat people up on the streets. Don't discriminate people who are going for job interviews except based on merit, obviously. And that's it. Like, can't we just live like that then? If those are the rules that you claim to follow. So demand consistency from them. Okay, that's what I would argue. We don't have to subscribe to pluralism. We don't have to subscribe to liberalism. Even in the ancient world, you could just say reciprocation, the law of reciprocation, the international law of reciprocation, which is you do this to me, you don't do this to me, and I won't do this to you. You treat me like this, and I'll treat you like this. And if we can agree that, then reciprocation. Okay, we don't need to use liberalism, pluralism. In the ancient world, they had tolerance. In the ancient world, they had tolerance of different religions. Usually, in most cases, ancient, not medieval Europe, but in the ancient world, Romans didn't care whether you were a Zoroastrian or a Hindu or what have you. Right? They didn't care so much. Right? They didn't care about Christians when they were worried about loyalty, but that's a different discussion. Your question about voting for Labour Party, all I would say is that the position that I've always discussed is one which I think, was his name? As perhaps similar to Frankie Boyle's position on the topic, for those who know, as well as Russell Brand initially, before he changed his mind, and as well as perhaps the Jehovah's Witnesses in that kind of sense, which is basically, look, you can live in this country, but if you basically participate in voting, just know that if you do so, then you affirm all the policies that the leader comes into power, and you also affirm their authority on you, even if you vote for the other person. Even if you vote for the person, because you have to accept the result of that vote. So if you want to do that, knowing that's be the case, then that's up to you. And if you don't, then that's up to you. I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. I will also say there is an Islamic opinion. People say, if you're worried that Muslims are going to get wiped out and killed, what have you, and the only way to stop that is by voting, some people say that's when it's permissible to get involved. But I would say that that's up to you and your conscience, and I advise you to look into the Islamic positions yourself and come to a conclusion yourself as to what position you think is the thing that you should adopt.
Moving on to Anas's question, do you guys remember it, or shall I have to repeat it?
Muslim groups with political in the UK. Sorry, who is it? Sorry, yeah. Does anyone want to venture into that, or shall I? I'm still in the spotlight, right? Still in the hot seat. Okay. There are some Muslim groups who have political agendas from Islamic basis in the Muslim world, right? So maybe you find some guy from, was it Tanzim Islam, the Pakistani political group, not to be confused with another Tanzim Islam, but there's a peaceful one that just wants a caliphate in Pakistan, or at least for the Muslim world, but it's based mostly in Pakistan, for example, right? Tanzim Islam, you've got Muslim Brotherhood, and you've got a whole number of other groups that you all know so well. Well, most of them seem to be directed towards the Muslim world, so campaigning the Muslim world. So I don't see how that would be a problem domestically in the West. There is only one group that I know of in the West that seems to campaign for this and gets a lot of attention by the media. And sometimes some people have had conspiracy theories as to why those members haven't been touched by the government despite sailing very close to the wind on terrorism, let's just say. But some people say they serve a purpose. They make people angry against Muslims. Then Muslims are desperate to do anything to capitulate anything to get out of that spotlight or get out of that pressure. All I'll say is with that group is there's a reason why they are a minority amongst Muslim group. I would say that with just one of you can have a wedding party with more guests attending than they have members. You know which group I'm referring to, Al-Muhajirun and their successors. So these people are irrelevant. I wish the media treated them as such, but unfortunately the media love to portray and to focus on their members and their groups, even though they're a very tiny, an extremely ridiculously tiny minority amongst Muslims, and Muslims, have issues with them more than perhaps even the non-Muslim communities in this country. So we know about that. That doesn't need to be answered. There's no one dithering about Al-Muhajirun here, right? But the question is, we shouldn't bundle Muslim groups which are talking about, put Islamic politics for the Muslim world in the same category as Al-Muhajirun. There are two distinct categories. Al-Muhajirun supports terrorism, whereas these other groups are actually peaceful groups. And we shouldn't label them together. The government would want you to, though. The government wants you to view them as all the same. And that's a problem, and we shouldn't play that game.
Okay. And the final question, which is from this brother.
Could you repeat it?
Oh, what the verse of the Quran were you talking about? Okay, so some people...
Is it fine if we just start with the other
That's fine.
Glad to hear it, and if you get an opportunity, I'm happy to answer those questions as well. But I'm saying that.
I thought we were going in that order, and I don't know what you wanted to do. If you want to...
I feel like most of the questions are for you anyway.
well, not quite, but... Okay, actually, the first brother's, let's say, rhetorical question. You say that the government are pushing a type of Islam on us. No, not a type of Islam. They're pushing liberalism with Islamic labels attached to it. Not a type of Islam. Never has been a type of Islam. Right? You can't even have a type of Islam which is basically based on philosophical liberal perspective, right? From a completely different basis. As to the quotation of the Quran, where some people have translated as certain people of certain religions will not be happy with you until you follow what they follow. It's a general thing, but I would also say that amongst people who are people of the book, there are exceptions to the rule. Those who are pious, those who are God-fearing. The Quran talks about amongst them are those who believe in God on the last day and do righteous deeds and so on and so forth. Practically, what I will say is there are those who are religious Jews and religious Christians who have the same concerns we do, and their schools are also being targeted under kind of secularization or even enforced liberalization or secularization, and they don't like it either. And we can have common cause with them. For example, look what happened in Germany. Was it a German court wanted to outlaw male circumcision, and the Jewish community came out and said, this is wrong, you're also going to be prosecuting us for this. And because of that German, was it I forgot which court it was, in Cologne, was it? Yeah, it was in Cologne. They reversed that because they knew that it was also going to target the Jewish community there. So that was when Jews came out and actually helped defend, you could say, an Islamic right. I mean, because that's because we have a common cause in that understanding for male circumcision, for example, right? So we can work together where we agree. Cooperate in the good and don't cooperate in the evil or bad things, right? So that's a general rule. I think we can go ahead and Hilf al-Fudul, right, which is the alliance for justice. So we can, and I've actually had many connections with religious Jewish organizations and groups, and religious Christian groups, and who actually agree with us on many issues concerning secular liberalism, have the same concerns, and we can have common cause with them on these issues where we agree, right? So, and that's something we should look into, and yeah.
But when you say British, the picture that comes to your mind isn't the religious Jews or the religious Christians. When you say British.
Oh, but you mentioned the verse of the Quran. Yeah, talking about people of the book, basically.
Saying about British Muslims.
Yeah.
So when you say British, that's not the picture that comes into your mind about
but as
religious Jews or religious Christians. It's the more liberal and it's the more the open-minded.
But don't fall into that trap of identifying British with liberal. Because Justin Welby himself, the Archbishop of Canterbury, said that if you're saying, said to the Conservative MP discussing these extremist laws ideas, he said if you're saying that belief in your religion or the values of your religion is higher than the state, then basically call me an extremist, because I believe that the dominion of or the kingdom of God is greater than the rule of law or the English state. Justin Welby said this, right? No one's going to call him an extremist, of course. Yeah. So that's where we can have common cause with such people on such topics. That's what I'm referring to. And you don't connect the idea of Britishness with secular liberalism, because there's nothing intrinsic in being British that makes you secular liberal. Throughout history, if you look at throughout history, if that was the case, then most of British history, Britain hasn't been British.
Thank you. Moving on to Selma, a minute, please.
So, going back to the question about, you put it that only left-wing and the Labour Party would somehow be promoting LGBT rights. Actually, we're living under a Tory government. It was a Tory government under which we had Trojan Horse and the demonisation and vilification of Muslim kids and Muslim parents. And the whole idea of British values came in on the back of that to say, this is what the state is saying versus this minority of Muslims. So they created this. So it was a Tory invention, so I don't think it's quite accurate to try and portray it as a Labour left-wing versus a Conservative, which is somehow closer to Islam. Not at all. And also, don't conflate that with... Because actually, when it comes to Labour MPs, even now, I was discussing this with Shabana Mahmood and Liam Byrne earlier, they're the ones who've defended the Muslim parents in the current issue that's going on. because it's able to make a distinction between promoting something and saying that you will stand against bullying and persecution. And that's a very, very clear line that we need to be absolutely uncompromising on. And a part of me is not comfortable with this kind of derogatory dismissal of the words pluralism and liberal, because each of them is loaded. In the same way, conservatism can be used in a pejorative way or a positive way. There was a time when in the Conservative Party there's a version of one nation tourism, which probably, I'll have some sympathy with. I'm not saying that the left is all wonderful and all great and the right is, it's up to us to have our criteria where we pick. But I find it interesting that on the one hand, what you're really advocating is don't participate in elections. Yet when you ally yourself with Jewish and Christian groups on circumcision and halal and kosher food, that's lobbying. That's political. So you can't escape it. And in the same way,
you can lobby.
If we don't, for you to say that by voting, that means you vote for every single thing that that party stands for, of course it doesn't. People are more intelligent than that. And I would argue the opposite as well, that by not voting, by not participating, you're relegating yourself to passivity, to having things done to you, whereas you should be shaping the agenda, challenging and bringing constructive solutions. And we have the numbers as well in many areas, in many cities, so there's no excuse not to.
Okay, do you have anything to say to those ask the questions?
The only thing I want to say, there was this issue about identity and whether these discourses on identity sort of imposed on Muslims. Identities are always reactionary. You construct identities, you define yourself because questions are asked at you. There's no other way of engaging in identity base. It's always a reaction. It's, you need to demarcate yourself against others. Others demarcate you, and so on. So, that's the way how identity is constructed. It's always a response to certain pressures that come from other people. That has always been the case like this.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions. What we're going to do now is the panelists are going to get 30 seconds and I'm going to count it using my fingers. Just for closing remarks, just to say any advice to the students of this uni as British Muslims or Canadian Muslims, and 30 seconds please, and we'll start on this side.
I don't need it. I think the only thing I would say is exactly what Salman said earlier. We need to be proactive as young Muslims, and the reality is it is our future, and we need to be at the front line of it, and we need to be leading it, and that's what my own advice I'll be giving you.
I'm obviously approaching that not from a normative theological perspective, but I think we just have to accept there's diversity within Islam. There are liberal Muslims, there are feminist Muslims. Again, some people might say they're not true Muslims, but they embrace this label. There are, I know Muslims who say I'm an agnostic Muslim. You might say it's impossible to be an agnostic Muslim, but they say, and again, as a researcher, obviously I don't want to take the label away, though. I'm obviously curious, say, well, what does it mean? So I think, we had this issue of personal experience. I don't really understand how else, am I running out of time? You can interpret Islam then from your personal experience, because we are in a body that has a skin color, that has a gender. We live in, a council estate. It's our personal experience that will always determine our understanding, our approach of Islam.
It was borrowing time.
Iqra, the very first word revealed. Read, question, understand. You're allowed to make mistakes, and your fitra, your original nature, is perfect as it is. Stay true to it. You have nothing to apologize for. You have everything to contribute. Make your mark.
I would say that we can actually agree that British is a description of your background. It's not a problem if you describe like that, like Salman al-Farsi, like Suhaib al-Rumi can do that, and that's not a problem. Anything more than that, where it's a moral basis, that's not an aspect which firstly it can provide, and nor is it a basis that Muslims or anyone in the ancient world even viewed it as. They viewed religion as your way of life, not nationality. Muslim is a description of your worldview you adopt, not a identity label you can slap on yourself. So if you don't adopt the Muslim worldview, Islamic worldview, on the basic things where there is no ikhtilaf on, then it doesn't matter what you call yourself, you don't fit the description. And lastly, I'd advise all of you, and this sounds very kind of vague, but to say go and study Because if you go and study, and I don't just mean Islam, I mean also you can see Western political philosophy, and you'll find things like, for example, John Locke, who argued that if you engage in the voting system, then you basically approve every decision that was been made by the government, not me saying this. So go and study yourself, and you will discover these things, and you'll be much wiser about the world, both as Muslims, and about Islam, as about the wider world in general, and all the non-Islamic ideologies and things like that.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank everyone who attended and managed to stay the full way. We've been planning this since like December, so it's quite sad that it's done, but you know, my back hurts and I want to go to sleep. So. I just want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank our amazing panellists for their different outlooks and amazing speeches. Can we just give them one last round of applause?